There is a particular kind of cold this story asks you to imagine tonight. Not the cold of a window left open in a modern house, but a colder, older kind, the kind that lives inside a body that has learned over years exactly how far it can be pushed before something breaks. So let your shoulders settle into whatever is holding you right now. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we are going back further than most stories dare to go to a single morning 10,000 years ago, when waking up at all was never something a person could simply assume. In the world we are about to enter, there is no promise written anywhere that a person who falls asleep will open their eyes again. Not because that world was needlessly cruel, but because it asks something of every single day that most of us rarely have to think about now, which is total unbroken attention. A sound missed in the dark, a wound that will not close, a hunt that goes wrong 2 days' walk from anyone who could help. Any one of these could be the last thing that ever happens to someone. This is not the story of one battle or one disaster. It is the story of what it actually took just to keep living one uncertain day after another, for years, for a lifetime, for as long as a person's luck could hold. Picture a woman lying still in the grey light just before dawn inside a shelter built of bent branches and stretched hide at the edge of a reed marsh in a place that will one day be called Yorkshire in the north of England. She does not open her eyes right away. First she listens. She listens for her daughter's breathing beside her, slow and even undisturbed. She listens for the dog curled near the entrance whose ears would lift at the first hint of movement through the reeds outside. She listens longest of all for footsteps coming from the direction of the lake because her husband left while the moon was still up to check the trap set along the water and he has not yet come back. Only once she has accounted for every sound does she allow herself to sit upright. Her hands are cracked from cold water and hours of rope work. The skin at her knuckles split in places that no longer fully heal, only close over and reopen with the next task. Her feet find the packed earth floor without needing to look, the small geography of this shelter memorized, completely the way a person memorizes anything that keeps them alive. Outside, somewhere beyond the reeds, a bird calls twice and falls faint, and she notes it the way another person might glance at a clock. An ordinary sound filed away without conscious thought, useful only if it changes. Before she eats, before she speaks a single word to her daughter, she confirms that everyone beneath this roof survived the night. That quiet automatic check will happen again tomorrow, and the morning after that. It is strange to sit with the idea that a woman doing this 10,000 years ago likely understood survival in the truest and most physical sense of that word more completely than almost anyone listening to this story tonight ever will. Stranger still, some of what she is about to do this morning, the small daily habits she never thinks twice about, have left marks that are still being read out of the ground in the present day. Before we go further into her world, I want to pause here for just a moment. If this is the kind of history you come looking for, told slowly, honestly, without rushing past what actually happened, it helps more than you might think if you take a moment to follow along and let me know that you are here tonight. And if you feel like it, leave a word about where you are listening from and what brought you to a story like this one. I read those, and I like knowing who else is out in the dark with me. Now let's settle in properly and let's go back. Her name is lost to us, along with almost everything about her that a name would normally carry, but the world she is waking into is not lost at all. It has a shape historians and archaeologists have spent more than a century reconstructing piece by careful piece, and it is worth understanding before we go any further into her single morning. 10,000 years ago places the world just past the end of the last great ice age in the early stretch of what scientists call the Holocene, the geological period we are still living in today. For tens of thousands of years before this point, huge sheets of ice had covered much of the northern hemisphere, locking away so much of the planet's water that sea levels sat far lower than they do now, and land bridges connected places that are separated by open ocean today. Then gradually, inevitably the ice began to retreat. Forests crept northward across land that had only known frozen tundra. Rivers found new paths. Sea levels rose slowly enough that within a single lifetime it was barely noticeable, but quickly enough that across a handful of generations entire coastlines quietly disappeared beneath the water. For the people living through this, none of it happened as a single dramatic event. There was no mourning when the old world visibly ended and a new one began. Instead, the ground itself, the animals, the plants, the rhythm of the seasons, all of it shifted slowly enough to feel almost permanent at any given moment, and only in hindsight does the scale of the change become visible at all. This is one of the genuine difficulties historians face when reconstructing this period. The evidence remains incomplete, pieced together from what the ground has chosen to preserve rather than from anything anyone wrote down, because writing itself was still thousands of years away. The population living through all of this was small, scattered, and constantly moving. Most researchers estimate that the entire human population of the world at this point numbered only in the low millions spread across every continent except Antarctica, which means that for most of human history up to this moment, another person, a stranger, was a genuinely rare thing to encounter. Communities were usually small, often no more than a few dozen people bound together by kinship and long familiarity, and everyone within that small group carried real, specific value. There was no such thing as an unnecessary person. A child was a future set of hands. An elder was a living archive of which winters had been survivable and which had not. Losing even one member of a group this size was not simply a private grief, it was a practical loss the entire community would feel for seasons afterward. What survives in the record suggests something remarkable, though. Human beings living through this transformation were not passive victims of a changing world. They were extraordinarily capable, deeply observant, and bound to one another by forms of cooperation and knowledge that modern life rarely requires of us. A family like the one in that shelter beside the marsh did not survive by luck alone, although luck mattered more than anyone would like to admit. They survived because they understood in intimate detail the particular stretch of land they called home, which plants could be eaten in which season, which animal tracks meant an easy meal, and which meant real danger. How long a fire needed to be tended through a long winter night, and what happened to the people in a shelter if it was allowed to die. It is worth knowing too that some of what these families built and used has survived far longer than anyone at the time could have imagined. In wetland sites not unlike the marsh in our opening scene, cold water-logged, oxygen-starved mud has preserved wood antler and bone for 10,000 years in conditions dry ground could never have allowed. Archaeologists working these sites have recovered wooden platforms, tools shaped from red deer antler, and traces of daily routines so specific that researchers can describe with real confidence what an ordinary day here actually looked like. We will return to that evidence directly later in this story, because it changes in some genuinely surprising ways how we understand this era. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. It is easy to picture a life like this as short and grim from beginning to end, but the most widely accepted reconstruction holds that a person who survived the truly dangerous years childhood most of all could often live into their 50s or 60s active and capable the entire time. The danger in this world was rarely spread evenly across a lifetime. It gathered instead at specific brutal thresholds, and childhood was the sharpest one of all. For now, though, stay with the woman in the shelter, and with the silence she is listening into as the light slowly grows outside. Her world is not the one we usually imagine when we picture the deep past, all sudden violence and constant chaos. It is quieter than that, and in many ways harder built from 10,000 ordinary mornings just like this one, each of them demanding to be survived before anyone could think about the next. Somewhere beyond the marsh, the sky is beginning to change from grey to something paler, and the first real light is starting to move across the water. Soon she will hear what she has been listening for: footsteps in the wet grass, or she will not, and either way the day will already be asking something of her. That single unremarkable morning, repeated across every family living through this era, in every landscape from frozen coastline to open grassland, is where this story actually lives. Not in one great turning point, but in the accumulated weight of countless mornings just like this one, each of them small, each of them demanding everything. Somewhere far beyond the reach of that one marsh in the north of England, on the same morning, under the same slowly brightening sky, thousands of other people are doing something almost identical. They are lying still in the dark, listening, counting breaths that are not their own, deciding whether it is safe to move yet. The specific dangers change from place to place, but the posture is the same everywhere. This was not a world of isolated hardship, one unlucky family in one unlucky place. It was in nearly every corner of the inhabited earth simply what a human life looked like. To understand why it helps to step back from any single shelter and look at the wider shape of the planet these people were living on, because 10,000 years ago the Earth itself was still in the middle of an enormous unfinished change. For most of the previous 100,000 years, huge portions of the northern hemisphere had lain under ice sheets thick enough to bury mountains. North America carried an ice cap that in places reached higher than most modern skyscrapers stacked on top of one another. Northern Europe sat beneath something similar. All of that frozen water had to come from somewhere, and it came from the oceans pulling sea levels down so far that dry land connected regions separated by open water. A person could once have walked without ever wetting a foot from what is now mainland Europe into what is now the island of Britain, across a wide stretch of hills, rivers and hunting ground that researchers now call Doggerland. By the time our story takes place, that land was already vanishing. Not suddenly, not in a single flood that anyone would have seen from a hillside, but steadily generation by generation as global temperatures rose and all that locked away ice returned to the sea. Coastal communities living along the edges of Doggerland would have watched familiar hunting grounds turn to marsh, then to shallow water, then disappear beneath waves entirely sometimes, within the span of a single long life. Growing old enough to walk your grandchildren to a stretch of coastline and tell them quite honestly that your own grandparents had hunted deer there on solid ground and that none of it exists anymore. Scholars still debate exactly how gradual or how abrupt certain stretches of this flooding were, since some evidence points to slow, creeping loss and other evidence suggests short, violent pulses when ice dams collapsed and sea levels jumped with startling speed. What is not in dispute is the underlying truth of it. The very ground beneath a family's feet, the thing that should have been the one stable fact of an unstable world, could not always be trusted to stay in place. This is worth pausing on because it reshapes how we should picture daily life in this era. It was not only wolves or hunger or a badly set snare that threatened a person living 10,000 years ago. It was the world itself quietly and continuously rearranging its own furniture on a timescale slow enough that no single year felt dangerous and fast enough that no single lifetime felt entirely safe either. A grandmother could describe a coastline to her grandchildren from memory, certain in every detail, and be describing a place that had already ceased to exist. And the ice sheets were not retreating in one smooth, gentle curve. Just before this period, the planet had lived through a genuinely strange climate event, a sudden and severe cold snap that appears to have interrupted the general warming trend for roughly 1,200 years, plunging much of the northern hemisphere back into conditions close to full glacial cold seemingly within a matter of decades. Researchers still argue over the precise mechanism, though the most widely accepted reconstruction points to a sudden influx of fresh cold meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean currents that normally carry warmth northward from the tropics. Whatever the exact cause, the human consequence is not difficult to imagine. Generations of people who had begun adapting to a warming world, expanding into newly green land, following herds into the territory their ancestors had never reached, suddenly found the world reversing beneath them. Forests that had crept northward retreated again. Herds that had shifted their migration routes shifted back or vanished from regions entirely. Whole ways of living built patiently across 100 years had to be abandoned or radically reworked within the space of a single generation. By the time of our marsh-dwelling family, that long cold interruption had finally truly ended, and the climate had settled into something closer to the world we would recognize today, though still restless, still capable of sudden local extremes. It is tempting to imagine this as a moment of relief, and in some ways it was. But a world that has just finished lurching between extremes does not immediately become predictable. It becomes instead a world where the older generation's hard-won knowledge, the knowledge that had kept their own parents alive, could no longer be trusted completely. A migration route that had worked reliably for a grandmother's entire life might simply stop working for her grandchildren, and no one could always say why. Across this shifting landscape, human beings had not responded with a single strategy. They had responded with dozens, each one shaped by the particular demands of a particular place, and the diversity of it is genuinely remarkable to consider. In the far north, along coastlines still rimmed with ice for much of the year, small groups built their entire existence around the sea, developing intimate generational knowledge of seal behavior, ice conditions, and the narrow windows when hunting was possible at all. A single misjudged crossing over sea ice that looked solid but was not could end a hunter's life in minutes, and that knowledge which stretch of ice to trust and which to avoid was worth more to a community than almost anything else it owned. Across the open grasslands further south, other communities followed herds of wild cattle and horses across enormous distances, timing their movements with an almost calendar-like precision built from nothing but observation passed down through story and demonstration. In river valleys and wetlands, like the one our marsh family called home, people built more settled, semi-permanent camps, returning to the same favoured locations, season after season, drawn by fish, runs waterfowl, and the reliable presence of fresh water. And in drier regions further south, still in parts of what would one day be called the Near East, something else entirely was beginning to stir, early experiments with tending wild grains, more deliberately than any hunting society before them had ever needed to. That particular thread of the story will matter enormously later, though it is not yet the story of the family we are following tonight. What ties all of these very different lives together is not geography and not even culture, but a shared underlying condition. Every one of these communities in every one of these landscapes was operating extremely close to the actual limits of what the land could support. There was no substantial surplus tucked away for a difficult season, no distant market to draw from, no institution capable of shipping food across a continent when a local herd failed to appear. If a hunting ground stopped producing, or a fishing season ran unusually short, or an expected herd simply did not arrive on schedule, the consequences were immediate and physical, not abstract. This is one of the genuinely difficult truths for a modern listener to sit with. It was not carelessness or a failure of ingenuity that made this life so precarious. These people were, by any honest measure, remarkably skilled, remarkably observant, remarkably adaptable. The precariousness came from the simple mathematics of living at the very edge of what a landscape could give, with almost nothing held in reserve against the world changing its mind. It is worth adding one detail here that tends to surprise people. The picture many of us carry of this era, small isolated bands wandering through an empty wilderness with no contact beyond their own immediate family, is not entirely accurate. Evidence from tools, ornaments, and raw materials found hundreds of miles from their point of origin suggests that these communities were connected by long, patient networks of exchange and contact trading valuable materials like flint shell, and worked stone across surprising distances and very likely sharing news, marriage partners, and hard-won knowledge about which routes and resources could still be trusted. A family in one river valley may well have known through relatives or trading partners that conditions 2 valleys over had shifted for the worse, long before they ever needed to find that out themselves. A particular kind of polished shell carried inland from a coast its owner had never personally seen could travel through a dozen different hands over the course of a single year, each exchange carrying a small fragment of news along with it. Isolation, in other words, was rarely absolute, even in a world this sparsely populated. Connection, thin and effortful as it must have been to maintain, was itself a form of survival. Back at the edge of the marsh, the woman from our opening scene has finally heard what she was listening for. Footsteps moving steadily through the wet grass toward the shelter, unhurried in a way that tells her before she even sees him that whatever happened at the lake this morning, it was not a disaster. She allows herself for the first time since waking something close to a full breath. But the relief of one morning does not undo the underlying truth of the world she lives in, a world of shifting coastlines and unreliable herds of hard-won knowledge that can expire without warning, of small communities holding on by skill, cooperation, and a thin, resilient thread of connection to people they may never meet. That world is about to ask something more of her family than simply surviving one more morning, and the shape of what comes next has already quietly begun to take form along the edges of the world she knows. Skill in this world was not a talent some people happened to have and others did not. It was closer to a second layer of the body itself, built up slowly from the moment a child could walk until it became so deeply automatic that the people carrying it rarely thought of it as knowledge at all. It was simply how a person moved through the world, the way breathing is simply how a person stays alive. Consider what a single ordinary day actually demanded of the man now standing at the entrance to the marsh shelter, setting down what he carried from the lake, glancing once toward his wife and daughter to confirm without needing to say it aloud that the household had held together in his absence. Before this morning even properly began, he had already read the surface of still water for the particular ripple pattern that meant something moving beneath it worth catching. He had judged wind direction against scent, aware that an animal downwind of him would smell him long before he came into view. He had noted the angle of early light against wet grass, and understood without any conscious calculation roughly how much of the morning remained before the tide in the nearby channels would shift and change what was reachable on foot. None of this felt to him like expertise. It felt like simply paying attention, the way anyone pays attention to traffic before crossing a modern street, except that the traffic here was an entire living landscape, and a single lapse in attention could cost far more than a startled step backward. This kind of knowledge did not arrive fully formed in any single mind. It accumulated patiently across many lifetimes passed from person to person, through the oldest and most reliable teaching method human beings have ever had, which is simply working alongside someone who already knows. A child did not learn to track an animal from an explanation. They learned by walking behind an adult for years, watching where that adult's eyes moved, noticing what made them pause, absorbing the shape of good judgment long before they could have articulated a single rule of it. Mistakes were corrected quietly in the moment, not through punishment so much as through the plain wordless logic of consequence. A poorly built shelter let the cold in. A misjudged distance meant a missed catch and a hungrier evening. The world itself was the teacher, relentless and fair in its own harsh way, and every surviving adult in a community like this one represented, quite literally, a lifetime of lessons that had not killed them. There is a particular kind of teaching that seems to have mattered more than any other, though it left almost nothing behind for archaeologists to hold in their hands: story. Long before anyone could write a single word down, a community's most dangerous and most valuable knowledge travelled through spoken narrative, repeats on winter evenings, shaped and reshaped slightly with each telling, embedding practical warning inside something memorable enough for a child to carry forward for 60 years. A story about a hunter who ignored the sound of ice cracking, or a family who ate an unfamiliar root too early in the season, was never simply entertainment. It was a survival manual disguised as something a person would actually want to listen to, dressed in enough detail and feeling that it lodged itself permanently in memory, ready to surface at exactly the moment a listener, now grown, faced the same choice their grandparent had once faced beside a different fire. It's worth pausing here on something that tends to surprise people because it complicates the picture many of us carry of this era as one of constant grinding labour with no room for anything beyond bare survival. Archaeological evidence from wetland sites of exactly this kind in exactly this period has turned up small, deliberately shaped lumps of birch bark tar, a kind of natural pitch created by carefully heating birch bark in a low-oxygen environment, a process that demands real technical understanding of temperature and timing to get right. Some of these lumps bear the clear, unmistakable marks of human teeth. For years, researchers debated exactly why people were chewing this substance, since it has a bitter, resinous taste with no obvious nutritional value. The most widely accepted explanation today is that the chewing itself served a practical purpose, softening the tar to make it more workable as an adhesive for hafting stone tools onto wooden handles, effectively turning a person's own mouth into a small portable workshop. But researchers studying these particular lumps in more recent years have managed something that would have sounded like fantasy only a few decades ago. Because saliva leaves a trace, and because the cold, waterlogged mud of these sites preserves organic material so completely, scientists have extracted genetic material directly from tar someone chewed 10,000 years ago, learning startlingly specific details, likely hair colour, likely eye colour, even something about the bacteria living in that person's mouth on the day they set the tar down and never came back for it. There is something quietly extraordinary in that image, worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. A person spits out a small piece of chewed pitch beside a lake on an unremarkable afternoon, thinking nothing more of it than we might think of discarding a piece of gum today, and 10,000 years later someone they could never have imagined existing reconstructs a fragment of their physical presence from that single careless gesture. Nothing about that moment was meant to last. Almost nothing from a life like this one was built to last. And yet a small piece of it did, patiently in the mud waiting. The skills passed down through a community like this extended, of course, far beyond toolmaking and tracking. Knowledge of the local landscape was encyclopedic in scope, though nothing about it resembled a formal encyclopedia. A capable adult in this world would have carried entirely in memory the location of dozens of different plant resources and the precise narrow windows in which each one was safe or worthwhile to gather. Certain roots that were nutritious in autumn could be genuinely dangerous if eaten too early in the season before specific compounds had broken down. Certain berries that looked nearly identical to a safe common variety carried a real risk of illness or worse, distinguishable only by details of leaf shape or growing location that an untrained eye would never notice. This kind of knowledge could not be guessed at. It had to be taught precisely and remembered correctly, because a single serious mistake made by a hungry, tired, or simply careless person could ripple outward to affect an entire small household. Medicine in the sense we would recognize it existed here too, though scholars still debate how much of what was used actually worked in the way people believed it did, as opposed to working through effects we might now describe differently: placebo response, basic hygiene, or simple rest enforced by ritual. Certain plants were understood to help with pain or fever, or the slow healing of a wound knowledge, built from generations of trial observation and the quiet, glamorous accumulation of what helped and what did not. Skeletal evidence from this period found across numerous sites shows healed fractures, some quite severe, that would have required real care and real time to mend, strong evidence that injured people were not simply abandoned to their fate but were tended, fed and protected while their bodies did the slow work of repair. One skeleton studied from a site of similar age shows a leg broken badly enough to have made walking, let alone hunting or travelling, impossible for months, and yet the bone healed cleanly in proper alignment, which tells its own quiet story of someone who stayed, who fed that person through a season they could not feed themselves, who judged the effort worth it. This detail matters enormously for how we should understand daily life here. It was hard, often brutally so, but it was not without tenderness. The people caring for an injured hunter through a difficult recovery were making a real calculation in a world with almost nothing to spare that this particular life was worth the food time and risk it took to save. The division of labour within a household or small band followed patterns that varied meaningfully from place to place, and the evidence remains genuinely incomplete on exactly how rigid or flexible these roles typically were. What does seem broadly consistent based on skeletal markers of physical stress, and the tools most commonly found associated with different individuals at burial sites, is that most adults, regardless of role, carried significant physical demands throughout their lives, and that survival depended on a household functioning as a coordinated unit rather than a collection of individuals each fending for themselves. Someone tended the fire and prepared food while others were away. Someone else processed hides, turning the raw, difficult material of a successful hunt into clothing, cordage, and shelter covering that would need to last through an entire season. Children from a surprisingly young age were not simply protected from this labour, but gradually folded into it, given small real tasks that mattered, learning competence through genuine contribution rather than isolated play. There was little concept in a world this precarious of childhood as a period entirely separate from the working life of the community. A child who could carry water was expected to carry water, and in carrying it was quietly absorbing everything else that task required them to notice along the way. What emerges from all of this taken together is a portrait considerably more sophisticated than the popular image of prehistoric life as simple, brutish, and thoughtless. These were people operating a highly refined, deeply tested body of practical knowledge, transmitted with real care across generations, covering everything from the chemistry of tar and the healing of broken bone to the precise, narrow safety windows of 100 different wild foods. None of it was written down, and so none of it survives in the form we usually associate with real understanding, but its absence from any book has nothing to do with its depth. It survived instead in hands in habit, in the quiet correction of a child's mistake, in the shape of a scar that healed, because someone stayed close enough to make sure it did. It survived too in the cadence of a story told beside a fire carrying warning, inside wonder, long after the person who first told it had been gone for generations. And yet for all of that hard-won mastery, for all the patient accumulation of everything a person needed to know to keep a small household alive through one more season, there remained a category of danger that no amount of skill could fully prepare a person for, a threshold where knowledge and care and careful preparation all met their absolute limit. That threshold sat closer to this family and to every family like them than any of them could have comfortably imagined on a morning as ordinary as this one. What does it actually take to bring down an animal capable of killing you in a single motion using nothing but a sharpened stick, a length of cord, and years of accumulated nerve? That question sat quietly and permanently at the centre of daily life for a family like the one we have been following, because among everything this world demanded of a person, few things demanded more than the hunt itself, and few things offered a clearer measure of exactly how thin the margin between mastery and disaster could be. The largest animal sharing this landscape with our marsh-dwelling family was not the red deer that provided so much of their food, clothing, and tools, though the deer themselves were far from harmless, capable of serious injury from a startled kick or a lowered antler at close range. The animal that truly commanded respect was the aurochs, an enormous wild ancestor of modern cattle, standing taller at the shoulder than most adult humans, weighing well over 1,000 pounds, and possessing a temperament that gave it no particular reason to run from a lone hunter carrying only wood and stone. A successful aurochs hunt could feed a small community for weeks and provide hide and sinew valuable enough to last a full year. A failed one could end a hunter's life in the time it took the animal to turn and charge. There was no meaningful middle outcome. Every hunter who walked toward one of these animals understood with total clarity that the encounter would resolve one way or the other within moments, and that no amount of skill entirely removed the danger, only reduced it carefully, patiently to something survivable more often than not. This is where the deep inherited knowledge described earlier in this story stopped being background texture and became quite literally the thing standing between a person and death. Successful hunters did not rely on strength alone, since strength alone was never going to be enough against an animal this large. They relied on understanding built across a lifetime of exactly where an animal's vision was weakest, how far downwind a group needed to remain to stay undetected, which terrain features could be used to funnel a target toward a prepared ambush rather than an open confrontation. Hunting an aurochs was rarely a solitary act of individual bravery, whatever the image in our heads might suggest. It was closer to a carefully rehearsed piece of choreography involving several people, each one holding a specific role, each one trusting the others completely, because a single person moving at the wrong moment could put the entire group in danger rather than only themselves. The weapons carried into an encounter like this were themselves the product of a technology far older and far more refined than most people imagine when they picture this era. By the time our marsh-dwelling family is waking to another ordinary morning, human beings had already been using the bow and arrow for many thousands of years, and the particular weapons found at sites of this exact period reveal a level of precision that rewards a closer look, rather than a single large stone point. Hunters of this era commonly relied on what archaeologists call microliths, tiny geometrically shaped flakes of flint, each one barely the width of a fingernail, carefully knapped and then set in careful rows along the edge of a wooden or bone shaft held in place with the very birch bark tar described earlier in this story. A single arrow might carry a dozen of these small blades embedded along its length, functioning together almost like a modern serrated edge, designed to cause the kind of wound that would weaken even a very large animal over time, rather than relying on a single point to deliver a killing blow outright. Producing even one of these tiny blades required real practiced precision. A single sharp strike against a carefully prepared flint core repeated dozens of times to produce enough microliths for a single hunting party's equipment. A skilled toolmaker could shape these blades quickly, almost without conscious thought, the same way a modern craftsperson might handle a familiar tool, but the underlying skill represented years of failed attempts, wasted stone, and patient correction before it became second nature. There is a detail from sites of exactly this period and region that tends to surprise people learning about it for the first time, and it concerns not weapons, but headwear. At certain wetland sites where organic material has survived in the mud for 10,000 years, archaeologists have recovered something genuinely unusual: red deer skulls with the antlers still attached, carefully modified and thinned so they could be worn on top of a human head, complete with holes bored through the bone that appear designed to secure the whole arrangement with cord. Scholars still debate exactly what these objects were for. One widely discussed possibility is that they functioned as hunting disguises, allowing a skilled tracker to move closer to a wary herd of deer than would otherwise be possible, blending into a group of animals that had learned through hard experience to fear the human silhouette, but not necessarily the silhouette of one more deer among many. Another possibility not mutually exclusive with the first is that these same objects carried a ceremonial or spiritual significance worn during rituals connected to hunting, success, or to mark a person's particular relationship with the animals their community depended on so completely. What survives in the record cannot settle the question definitively, since bone and antler carry no explanation of their own meaning, only the physical trace of having been carefully shaped, worn, and eventually set down. But either explanation or both together points to the same underlying truth. Hunting in this world was never simply a physical task. It was something closer to a discipline wrapped in skill, in risk, and quite possibly in a kind of reverence for the animals whose deaths kept human beings alive. The dangers of this landscape were not limited to the animals people actively pursued either. Wolves moved through these same forests and wetlands in numbers difficult for a modern listener to fully picture, and while direct wolf attacks on humans appear to have been genuinely rare, based on the scarcity of skeletal evidence suggesting otherwise, their presence still shaped behavior constantly. A wolf pack following the same herds a human family depended on was not simply a passive neighbor. It was a competitor for the same limited resource, and an opportunistic one capable of taking an unprotected kill left unattended for even a short time or in leaner seasons, testing the boundaries of what it might risk approaching. Brown bears too shared this world, generally avoidant of humans, but formidable enough that any encounter demanded absolute immediate seriousness. A family living at the edge of a marsh like ours would have understood without needing it explained that certain sounds in the night carried different weights of urgency, and that the correct response to each one had to be immediate and correct, because there was rarely a second chance to reconsider a wrong guess. It's worth asking too what happened to a household when a hunt went wrong, because the consequences rarely stopped with the person injured or killed. A community this small operated with almost no redundancy built into it. Losing a single capable adult hunter did not simply mean one fewer person to grieve. It meant a genuine immediate reduction in the group's ability to secure meat, hide and bone for every poor remaining season that year, a burden that fell often quite suddenly on whichever adults remained. Widows and orphaned children in a community like this were rarely abandoned, since the same cooperative structures that made daily survival possible also extended as a matter of practical necessity as much as compassion to absorbing a household that had lost its primary hunter. But the arithmetic of loss was real and unforgiving. A single bad afternoon beside an aurochs could quietly reshape the fortunes of an entire small community for the following year, and everyone within that community understood this, even if they rarely spoke of it directly. It would be easy telling this part of the story to lean into fear for its own sake, and that is not the intention here, nor is it an honest picture of daily experience. Most days did not end in confrontation with an aurochs or a close call with a wolf pack. Most days were long, physically demanding, but ultimately ordinary, filled with the quieter work of gathering, processing, mending, and watching. The danger described here was real, but it was also in a strange way familiar, woven so completely into daily rhythm that it rarely produced the kind of constant paralyzing fear a modern person might imagine feeling in the same circumstances. A person raised inside this world from birth did not experience an aurochs the way we might experience one as an abstract, terrifying unknown. They experienced it as one more known quantity in a landscape full of known quantities, dangerous, respected, and with sufficient skill and caution survivable more often than not. There is a kind of confidence that only comes from growing up entirely inside a particular danger rather than encountering it as an adult for the first time, and it is worth trying to imagine what that confidence actually felt like from the inside. A young hunter approaching their first serious kill would not have felt the pure, undiluted fear a modern person might expect, since fear alone rarely produces steady hands and clear judgment. They would have felt something closer to focused readiness, built from years of smaller, supervised encounters, each one slightly more demanding than the last, until the body itself had learned what the mind alone never fully could: exactly how to move, how to breathe, how to wait. This is in its own quiet way one of the more remarkable aspects of how humans in this era raise their children. Competence around real danger was not something a person acquired suddenly at some fixed age. It was built gradually, deliberately, in careful stages by adults who understood better than almost anyone in the modern world reliably does exactly how much responsibility a young person could safely be trusted with and when. What this era asked of its people in the end was not raw courage in the sense we often imagine it, some singular moment of heroic bravery. It asked for something quieter and more demanding: sustained competence held steadily across thousands of ordinary days, because competence, not courage, was what actually kept a person alive when a 1,000-pound animal turned unexpectedly, or when a wolf pack lingered a little too close to a resting camp. Skill was not a way of making this world less dangerous. It was more precisely the only genuine shield a person had against a danger that could never fully be removed, only managed carefully, generation after generation, by people who had learned exactly how much respect this world required and paid it without complaint. And skill, however complete, however hard won, could only ever protect a person from the dangers that skill was designed to answer. There remained waiting quietly at the edges of even the most capable household a different category of threat entirely, one that no amount of hunting knowledge, no carefully worn antler, frontlet, no lifetime of reading, wind and water could fully guard against, and it was closer to this family in this particular season than any of them yet understood. Not every danger in this world announced itself with claws or antlers or the weight of an animal large enough to end a life in a single charge. Some of the most serious threats a person could face here arrived quietly from inside the body itself, at moments that had nothing to do with courage or skill or years of careful training, and everything to do with simple biology working exactly as it always had in a world with almost none of the tools we now take for granted to help it along. Consider for a moment something almost everyone listening to this story either has experienced directly or knows intimately through someone they love. Childbirth in the world. Our marsh-dwelling family inhabits was not simply difficult. It was by a wide margin one of the most dangerous events an adult woman would ever face, more dangerous in raw statistical terms than most of the hunting encounters described earlier in this story. This is not speculation shaped to fit a particular narrative. It reflects something genuinely unusual about human beings as a species, a trait scientists sometimes describe as the obstetrical dilemma, the difficult evolutionary trade-off between a pelvis narrow enough to allow efficient upright walking and a human infant's head, which is proportionally larger relative to its mother's body than in almost any other primate. Human childbirth has always been more physically demanding and more genuinely risky than it is for most other mammals, and in a world without modern medical intervention, that underlying difficulty was not softened by anything at all. A woman in this era, giving birth, relied entirely on the accumulated knowledge of other women, usually older female relatives or experienced members of the community who had themselves survived multiple births and had watched closely and repeatedly what worked and what did not. This knowledge was real and it mattered enormously. Certain positions eased a difficult labor. Certain plants applied or consumed at the right moment appear to have helped manage pain or bleeding, though scholars still debate exactly how effective many of these remedies actually were, separating genuine physiological benefit from the very real comfort of simply not facing the moment alone. Birth itself was almost never a solitary event in this world. Whatever image a modern listener might carry of a lone woman managing entirely on her own, it was more often a gathering of exactly the people whose presence had proven useful across many previous births, a small, practiced team bringing warm water, steady hands, and the calm authority of having done this difficult work before. What this knowledge could not do, no matter how skilled or experienced the women attending a birth were, was overcome a genuinely obstructed labour or stop severe bleeding once it had begun in earnest. In situations like these, which arose with real uncomfortable frequency, there was often nothing anyone present could do beyond staying close, offering whatever comfort was possible, and bearing witness to an outcome that skill alone could not change. It is worth pausing here gently on what the evidence actually tells us, because the picture is more layered than a single grim statistic might suggest. Skeletal remains from populations of this general period and lifestyle, studied across multiple sites, show clear evidence that maternal death during or shortly after childbirth was a real and significant cause of adult female mortality. Though the evidence remains incomplete when it comes to establishing precise rates for any single community, since burial practices and the fragility of certain remains make exact reconstruction genuinely difficult. Some researchers comparing patterns across different regions have suggested the risk may have varied considerably depending on local diet, general health, and the particular knowledge a given community had accumulated around difficult births. Though isolating any single factor with real confidence remains an open and actively studied question, what is not difficult to establish is the emotional and practical weight this reality placed on every single household. A pregnancy in this world was met quite understandably with a mixture of hope and real unspoken apprehension carried by the woman herself and by everyone who loved her, because everyone present had almost certainly witnessed at some point in their lives a birth that did not end well. Infancy and early childhood carried their own steep, unforgiving risks distinct from the dangers of birth itself. Estimates drawn from skeletal populations across this broader era suggest that a substantial proportion of children in many communities, close to half, did not survive to see their 15th year, a figure that can be genuinely difficult to absorb for a modern listener, particularly one who has raised or loved a child. The causes were varied and often interconnected: illness moving quickly through a small, closely living group, inadequate nutrition during difficult seasons, accidents that a small, curious child's body simply could not survive the way an adult's might. One particular threshold appears across multiple studies to have carried unusually concentrated risk: the period surrounding weaning, when a young child moved away from mother's milk and its accompanying immune protection toward the same solid foods the rest of the household relied on. Researchers can now identify roughly when weaning occurred for a given individual by analyzing the ratio of certain chemical isotopes preserved in developing teeth, since a nursing infant's body chemistry differs measurably from a weaned child eating solid food, and that difference is recorded permanently in the same enamel that also carries the stress markers described a moment ago. What these combined chemical signatures reveal again and again across different sites is a genuine spike in mortality clustered around this transition, a vulnerable window during which a child's developing body had to adjust, often quite suddenly, to a completely new source of nutrition and immune protection, precisely the kind of change that left little room for error in a world without any modern medical safety net whatsoever. This does not mean parents in this era loved their children any less fiercely than parents do today. If anything, the evidence suggests the opposite: careful, deliberate burial practices for even very young children, Grave goods selected with obvious care, skeletal evidence of medical attention given to sick or injured infants well beyond what pure practical calculation alone would explain. Grief in this world was not softened by familiarity. It was simply carried more often by more people across more households than most of us listening tonight will ever have to carry it ourselves. There is a genuinely remarkable scientific detail connected to all of this that tends to surprise people, and it involves something as small and ordinary as a single tooth. As a child's teeth form the enamel records in a permanent and physically readable way. Moments of significant physical stress, periods of illness, malnutrition, or interrupted growth, leaving behind faint horizontal lines and pits that a trained researcher can identify centuries later using nothing more than careful microscopic examination. These marks are called enamel hypoplasia, and they function almost like a diary written involuntarily by the body itself, a record the person who carried it never knew existed and certainly never intended to leave behind. Studies of teeth from populations of exactly this period and way of life show these stress markers appearing with real regularity, often clustering around a particular predictable stretch of the year. The tail end of winter and the earliest weeks of spring, when stored food from the previous autumn's harvest of nuts, dried meat and preserved plant material had largely run out, and the new season's resources, fresh greens returning. Fish, runs of newborn animals, had not yet fully arrived. This stretch of the calendar had a real functional name among people who study societies living close to the edge of what a landscape provides, sometimes called the hunger gap, and it appears based on this dental evidence to have been a genuinely universal experience across an enormous range of otherwise very different communities, from coastal fishing settlements to inland forest camps to the open grassland herders described earlier in this story. Researchers examining these seasonal stress patterns across multiple widely separated sites have found the same narrow window of vulnerability appearing again and again, a striking, quiet consistency that speaks less to any single culture's particular hardship and more to a shared biological reality, facing nearly all human communities living this way, regardless of where on the map they happen to be standing. What must it have taken then to move through this same narrowing season year after year, watching stored supplies dwindle while waiting with no certainty at all for the return of abundance that every single year before had eventually arrived, but that carried no guarantee of arriving again. A person living through this world did not simply endure hardship in a general abstract sense. They lived inside a calendar with the genuinely dangerous season built directly into it, predictable in its timing but never predictable in its severity, arriving with quiet, patient regularity every person's life. It would be a mistake hearing all of this to imagine a household defined entirely by dread waiting passively for disaster to arrive on its own schedule. That is not what the evidence suggests, and it is not most likely how these families actually experience their own lives. The same resourcefulness described earlier in this story, the deep inherited knowledge of which foods could be preserved, and how which resources could be stretched furthest, which combinations of dried, smoked, and stored provisions could carry a household through the leanest weeks, existed specifically because communities had faced this same seasonal narrowing many times before and had developed real effective strategies for managing it. Smoking meat over a low, carefully tended fire could preserve it for months. Certain nuts gathered in autumn abundance and stored in cool, dry conditions could remain edible and nourishing well into the following spring. Dried fish, prepared in quantity during the most productive weeks of a good season, became a kind of insurance against the leaner ones that inevitably followed. None of this made the hunger gap comfortable, but it made it survivable, transforming what could have been an annual catastrophe into something closer to a demanding familiar test one this family and their neighbours had already passed many times before. There is also a quieter, more communal dimension to how households weathered this seasonal narrowing, one easy to overlook if we focus only on stored food and individual preparation. Extended kinship networks, the same long patient webs of connection and exchange described earlier in this story, mattered enormously during precisely this stretch of the year. A household whose stores had run unusually low, whether through bad luck illness or simply a smaller than usual autumn harvest, could reasonably expect some measure of support from relatives or trading partners whose own stores had fared better. This was not charity in any sentimental modern sense. It functioned as a kind of distributed insurance understood by everyone as a practical necessity, since the household offering help this particular spring might well be the one needing it the next, and a community that let its weakest members starve in a bad year would find itself considerably weaker and considerably less resilient the following year in turn. But competence and preparation, however thorough, could only ever reduce risk, never eliminate it entirely, and this particular season carried its own quiet uncertainty for the family we had been following all along. The woman standing now at the entrance to her shelter, relieved that her husband has returned safely from the lake, carries inside her own body a piece of knowledge she has not yet spoken aloud to anyone, a private awareness that will in the weeks ahead ask something enormous of this household and of her, that neither skill nor experience alone can fully prepare a person for. She tells him that evening, once the fire has been built up properly, and her daughter has finally settled into sleep, and she tells him the way most difficult news in this world was told quietly, directly, without ceremony. She is carrying another child. His reaction is not one of surprise so much as recognition, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid silent arithmetic, weighing hope against risk in the same breath, because he has lived beside this woman long enough to know exactly what both of those words mean in a life like theirs. There is real joy in this news, and neither of them pretends otherwise. There is also sitting quietly beneath that joy an honest awareness of everything. This story has already described the dangers of birth itself, the narrow, dangerous window surrounding weaning, the simple, unforgiving math of one more mouth to feed through winters that do not always cooperate. Both truths exist here at once without contradiction, the way they so often did in a world that rarely offered anyone the comfort of an uncomplicated feeling. It's worth stepping back from this one family for a moment, because the world surrounding them was at this point in the broader story of this era still capable of shifting in ways far larger and far faster than any single household's private hopes or fears. Earlier in this story, we described the slow, patient drowning of Doggerland. That wide stretch of low hills and rivers, once connecting what is now mainland Europe to what is now Britain, vanishing gradually beneath rising seas across many generations. That description was accurate, but it was not the complete picture, because the geological and archaeological record preserves evidence of something else entirely, an event far more sudden, far more violent than the slow creep of rising water alone. To understand it properly, it helps to picture the seafloor itself, not as a fixed, unchanging surface, but as something with its own slow, hidden history layer after layer of sediment building up over thousands upon thousands of years along the edge of the continental shelf, carried there by rivers and ocean currents from a land mass still adjusting to the loss of its ice age burden. That accumulated weight does not sit forever without consequence. In certain places the build-up becomes unstable, saturated with water, resting at an angle steeper than the material can indefinitely support until something, a distant earthquake, a shift in pressure, or simply the accumulated weight itself finally gives way all at once. Off the coast of what is now Norway, along the edge of the continental shelf, an enormous section of underwater sediment built up over many thousands of years gave way in a massive submarine landslide, one of the largest of its kind ever identified anywhere on Earth. Researchers date this event known today as the Storegga Slide to roughly this general era, though scholars still debate the precise decade or even century in relation to any single community's lived experience, since dating an undersea landslide with true precision remains genuinely difficult even with modern techniques. What is not in dispute is the scale of what happened next. A landslide of this size displacing an almost unimaginable volume of seafloor sediment in a very short span of time generated a tsunami that radiated outward across the North Atlantic and the North Sea, striking the coastlines of Norway, the Faroe Islands and Scotland, with waves that geologists estimate, based on the height and inland reach of the sand and debris layers still found preserved today, may have risen well over 10 meters in the most exposed locations. This is where the story connects most directly back to the low marshy coastline our family calls home. The eastern reach of that same tsunami crossed the shrinking waters of the North Sea and struck the remaining edges of Doggerland itself, along with the low coastal regions of what is now eastern Britain, sweeping inland across ground that in some places would already have been perilously close to sea level after generations of gradual flooding. Geologists have identified the physical signature of this event with remarkable clarity, a distinct layer of sand shell fragments and marine sediment entirely out of place amid the surrounding peat and freshwater deposits sitting at a consistent depth in core samples taken from bogs and estuaries across a wide stretch of coastline, a silent buried record of a single catastrophic afternoon, written directly into the ground itself. It is genuinely difficult to know, and scholars are honest about this difficulty, exactly how many communities like the one we have been following experienced this event directly, or how many were fortunate enough to be inland upland or simply elsewhere when the water arrived. Excavations at coastal and near coastal sites across this broader region have in a small number of cases turned up sudden unexplained gaps in human occupation, layers of use followed by a period of apparent abandonment before activity resumes, sometimes only after a considerable stretch of time. Archaeologists are careful appropriately not to draw too direct a line between any single abandoned site and this specific tsunami sea, since a gap in the archaeological record can arise from many causes, but the timing at some locations aligns closely enough with the sand and sediment layer described a moment ago that the connection is at the very least a genuinely plausible one under active study. What we can say with real confidence is that a wave of this scale moving across a landscape this low and this densely threaded with rivers, marshes and coastal camps would have offered almost no meaningful warning and very little possibility of outrunning it on foot. This was not the slow generational loss described earlier in this storyland, disappearing gradually enough that a person could adjust, migrate and plan around it across the span of a lifetime. This was something else entirely, the same underlying process of a warming rising world, but compressed without warning into the span of perhaps a single hour. There is something worth sitting with, honestly here, and it is this. Much of what makes this era so quietly demanding, the seasonal hunger, the dangers of childbirth, the risks of the hunt, followed patterns that a person could learn, anticipate and prepare for across a lifetime of careful observation. An event like this one did not follow any pattern a human lifetime could have taught anyone to expect. No grandmother's story, however detailed, could have prepared a coastal community for a wave arriving with no visible storm, no gathering clouds, nothing in the sky or the wind to suggest that anything at all was wrong, till the water itself was already moving across the land. This is, in its own way, one of the most sobering truths the story has to offer, so far that even the deepest, most hard-won knowledge this world had to give its people carried limits, and that some dangers simply could not be read in advance, no matter how closely a person had learned to watch. And yet even here in the description of something this severe, it is worth resisting the pull toward pure catastrophe, because that would not be the complete or accurate picture either. The very networks of connection and exchange described earlier in this story, the long patient threads linking one small community to the next across considerable distances, would have mattered enormously in the aftermath of an event like this one. A community that lost its coastal camp, entirely its stores, its shelters, perhaps some of its own people, was not simply left to face that loss in total isolation. Relatives and trading partners, further inland communities whose own location had spared them the worst of the wave, represented a real practical avenue toward eventual recovery, shelter, shared food, and the slow, patient work of rebuilding a life from what remained. Human resilience in this era rarely looked like heroic individual survival against impossible odds. It looked far more often like exactly this, communities absorbing each other's losses quietly and without ceremony, because that was simply what a functioning society did when the world took something from one of its parts. There is a particular kind of question that tends to surface once a listener sits with an event like this for a while, and it is worth asking plainly rather than leaving it unspoken. How does a community actually recover in any real sense from a single afternoon capable of erasing what generations had built along a stretch of coastline? The honest answer, drawn from what the broader archaeological pattern across this period suggests, is slowly, unevenly, and through exactly the kind of quiet, cooperative rebuilding already described, rather than through any single dramatic turning point. Some coastal locations once abandoned appear to have been resettled by later generations, who either did not know or chose not to dwell on what had happened there before, drawn back by the same practical advantages: freshwater fish, fertile marshland that had made the location valuable in the first place. Others were abandoned permanently, their former inhabitants folding into inland communities and never returning the specific memory of what had happened there, fading generation by generation into the kind of half-remembered caution that eventually becomes simply a feeling about a place untethered from the original event that produced it. What does an event of this magnitude actually mean for a family like ours, still sitting beside their own small fire on an ordinary evening, having just shared news that carries its own private mixture of hope and worry? It does not mean necessarily that this specific household stood directly in the tsunami's path, since the record cannot tell us that with any certainty, and the honest, careful answer is that we simply do not know precisely how this family's own particular story intersects with this particular event. What it does mean, and what matters for understanding the shape of their world, is that they were living inside a landscape capable of turning suddenly and completely dangerous, not only through the slow, familiar rhythms of season and scarcity already described, but through forces operating on a scale so far beyond individual experience that no accumulated skill, however deep, could fully account for them. The coastline this family knew, the marshes and channels their entire way of life depended on, existed within reach of a world that occasionally, and without any real warning at all, chose to remake itself entirely. This is, in the end, one of the genuine quiet truths sitting beneath everything this story has described so far. A person living 10,000 years ago built an entire life from mastery, from careful observation, from knowledge, passed down with real precision across countless generations, and that mastery mattered enormously, keeping households alive through hunts, hunger, birth, and ordinary hardship more often than not. But underneath all of that hard-won competence sat a world still finishing an enormous transformation of its own, one that occasionally moved not with the patient, learnable rhythm of the seasons, but with the sudden, indifferent scale of geology itself, a reminder that even the most capable, most attentive people alive were still in the end living on the surface of a planet doing something none of them had ever fully witnessed before, and would not fully understand for another 10,000 years. By tale of fire, the woman rests one hand quietly against her own body, and her husband reaches over to cover it with his. Neither of them speaking again for a long moment. Whatever the wider world was doing in that particular instant on that particular evening, this small private fact remained true and unchanged, that something new was beginning here, fragile and uncertain in a world that had already shown this family, in more ways than one, exactly how quickly everything familiar could change. Night in this world was never simply the absence of daylight. It was its own separate country governed by different rules, demanding a different kind of attention than anything the daylight hours required, and understanding what a single night actually asked of a person, like the woman we have been following, brings us as close as this story will come to the true quiet center of what made this era so genuinely brutal. The most immediate danger of any given night had nothing to do with wolves or bears or any of the large dramatic threats described earlier in this story. It was cold. Simple, patient, unglamorous cold, the kind that did not announce itself with a growl or a charge, but simply steadily drew warmth out of the sleeping body until something essential stopped working correctly. This process, which modern medicine now understands with real precision, begins quietly enough that a person experiencing it often has no idea. Anything is seriously wrong, the body's core temperature drops by only a small amount at first, shivering increases, thinking grows slightly foggy, and a dangerous kind of confusion can set in precisely when clear thinking matters most, since a person growing genuinely cold sometimes stops recognizing the danger they are in at all. A fire allowed to die completely on a genuinely cold night was not a minor inconvenience to be dealt with come morning. For an infant or an elderly relative or anyone already weakened by illness or a difficult season, it could be the actual difference between waking and not waking at all. This is precisely why the responsibility of tending a fire through the night carried such real weight in a household like ours, why someone almost always remained at least partially alert through even the deepest hours of darkness, feeding small amounts of fuel at intervals, judging the wind, watching the coals, the way a person today might watch a sleeping child's breathing. It was quiet work, unglamorous, repeated every single night of a person's life. And it was also, without exaggeration, one of the most consistently life-preserving tasks this entire way of living depended on. Clothing and bedding mattered here in ways that are easy for a modern listener to underestimate, tucked away as most of us are inside heated homes for the entirety of a winter night. Hides from the very animals this family hunted, carefully prepared, scraped and softened, through a lengthy process passed down, exactly like every other skill described in this story, formed the difference between a survivable night and a genuinely dangerous one. A poorly cured hide, stiff and imperfectly treated, offered far less protection than one properly worked, and the specific technique for achieving real softness and warmth, involving repeated working of the hide by hand, sometimes with the addition of animal fat or brain matter to help preserve and soften the fibers, represented yet another entire body of specialized knowledge a capable adult in this world was simply expected to carry. A family that had not prepared adequate bedding and clothing before the arrival of the coldest months was not facing mere discomfort. They were facing a genuinely elevated risk to the youngest and oldest members of their household, and everyone in a community like this understood the stakes of that preparation with total clarity. Illness moved through this world with a different character than the sudden visible dangers this story has already described. And in some ways it was more frightening precisely because of that difference. A wound, however serious, at least announced itself, plainly giving the people around an injured person something concrete to respond to. Illness, particularly the kind that began quietly inside the body without any obvious external cause, offered no such clarity. A person could wake feeling perfectly well and within a handful of days be gravely ill with no snare, no animal, no misjudged crossing anywhere in the story to explain why. There is a specific, genuinely surprising thread of evidence connected to this that tends to reshape how people picture daily suffering in this era, and it comes from something as ordinary as teeth. Skeletal remains from populations across this broad period show remarkably heavy dental wear, far more pronounced than anything typical in a modern population, the direct result of a diet built around tough, fibrous, often gritty foods, meat processed with stone tools that left tiny mineral fragments behind roots and plant material chewed thoroughly to extract every available nutrient. That wear over the course of a lifetime frequently exposed the softer inner structure of a tooth to infection and dental abscesses, a painful buildup of infection. At the root of a damaged tooth appear with real frequency in skeletal remains. From this period, sometimes severe enough that researchers can see directly in the bone itself the physical damage such an infection eventually caused. In a world without antibiotics, without any reliable way to treat a serious infection once it had taken hold, a dental abscess was not merely a source of significant ongoing pain, though it was certainly that. It represented a genuine, if often slow-moving threat to life itself, since an untreated infection of this kind could spread beyond the jaw into surrounding tissue, and in the most severe cases into the bloodstream entirely. A person might survive weeks or months of steadily worsening pain, managing it as best they could with whatever plant-based remedies the community's accumulated knowledge offered, before an infection that began in a single damaged tooth eventually became something the body simply could not overcome. Is it strange, then, to think that a source of pain most of us would resolve today in a single brief appointment could once represent one of the more quietly dangerous ailments a person might face across an entire lifetime? It is a genuinely sobering thought, worth sitting with gently for a moment, that something as commonplace and treatable today as a dental problem could in this world represent a real and serious mortal threat, arriving not through danger or misfortune in any dramatic sense, but simply through the ordinary wear of a hard demanding diet chewed patiently meal after meal across an entire lifetime. And yet set directly alongside this quiet grinding danger sits something that complicates any simple picture of this era as merely brutal and unforgiving, because the evidence also shows genuine, remarkable medical intervention taking place, intervention far more sophisticated than most people would expect from a world this old. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from populations broadly contemporary with our family have identified clear examples of trepanation, a surgical procedure in which a section of the skull is deliberately removed, typically using a sharpened stone tool worked slowly and carefully through the bone. The reasons behind this procedure remain genuinely debated among researchers, some evidence pointing toward treatment for severe head injury or persistent debilitating headache, other evidence suggesting a possible ritual or spiritual dimension, alongside any practical medical purpose. What is not in dispute, and what makes this detail so quietly remarkable, is the physical evidence of healing found around many of these surgical openings. Smooth, rounded bone growth indicating that a meaningful number of people who underwent this procedure survived it, sometimes by many years. Performing successful skull surgery, using nothing but stone tools and accumulated practical knowledge in a world without any understanding of infection in the way we understand it today, represents a level of surgical skill and nerve that deserves genuine respect, whatever the exact purpose behind any individual procedure actually was. This pairing dental infection, quietly capable of ending a life, and skull surgery successfully performed and survived, tells us something important about how we should understand medical risk in this era. It was not simply that these people lacked medical knowledge or skill. In many respects, their practical medical understanding, built from direct, repeated experience rather than any theoretical framework, was genuinely impressive. What they lacked, and what no amount of skill or careful practice could substitute for, was the specific, invisible knowledge of infection, at a level we would now call microscopic, the understanding that would eventually allow later generations to prevent, rather than simply manage so many of the illnesses that quietly claimed lives in this world. A surgeon capable of successfully removing a section of skull could still only weeks later lose a patient to an infected tooth, not through any failure of skill, but because the two problems demanded entirely different kinds of understanding, one visible and mechanical, one invisible and biological, and only one of those had as yet been worked out through patient trial and careful observation. What did all of this actually mean for the day-to-day emotional experience of living inside this world for a person like the woman we have been following, now carrying a second pregnancy into a household that had already faced its share of ordinary danger? It meant in practice a particular kind of steady background awareness, present without necessarily being paralyzing, that any given illness, any given wound, any given ordinary ache carried a weight it would not carry in the world we live in now. A cough that lingered a little longer than usual. A small wound that seemed slower than expected to close. These were not most of the time cause for panic, since most illnesses in this world, as in ours, resolved themselves without becoming serious. But they were never entirely dismissed, either watched instead with the same patient practiced attention that this family applied to weather, to tide, to the movement of animals across their landscape, because in a world this precarious, genuine attentiveness was very often the only meaningful tool available against a threat that could not always be seen coming. It would be easy, hearing all of this laid out together, to imagine a life defined primarily by dread, every ordinary sensation scanned constantly for hidden danger. That was almost certainly not how it actually felt day to day to live inside this world. Human beings then as now adapt remarkably well to living alongside real persistent risk, folding awareness of it into the ordinary rhythm of daily life rather than carrying it as constant conscious fear. A person raised entirely inside this reality experienced these risks the way we experience the ordinary risks of our own world, present real, occasionally worth genuine worry, but rarely dominating a person's actual felt experience of an ordinary day. What made this world brutal was not that its people lived in constant terror. It was more precisely that the margin for error in matters both large and small ran genuinely thin, thinner than almost anything a modern listener has ever had to personally navigate, and that thinness is quiet and largely unspoken, sat beneath even the calmest, most ordinary evening beside a fire. There is a broader pattern worth naming here, one that researchers studying skeletal populations from across this era have documented with real consistency, and it concerns not any single ailment, but the cumulative physical toll of a life this demanding carried in the bones themselves. Evidence of joint degeneration. The kind we would now associate with advanced age appears with notable frequency in individuals who, based on other skeletal indicators, were still relatively young by any modern reckoning. Decades of repetitive physical labor carrying, kneeling, hauling, processing hides and butchering game, using the same movements thousands upon thousands of times across a lifetime left a permanent, measurable signature on the skeleton, a kind of accumulated wear, not unlike what shows up in the joints of people today who spend a working lifetime in physically demanding trades, though considerably more pronounced and considerably more universal across the population as a whole. Scholars still debate exactly how much pain this level of wear actually produced for any given individual, since the relationship between visible skeletal change and lived felt discomfort is not always straightforward, but the physical evidence leaves little doubt that a body in this world, however skilled and capable, was also a body being steadily, gradually spent, season after season, in service of keeping a household alive. None of this diminishes what this family and countless families like them actually managed to build across a single ordinary lifetime. If anything, it deepens it. A person carrying real cumulative physical strain alongside the ever-present possibility of infection injury or a night that turned unexpectedly cold, still rose each morning to check that everyone beneath their roof had survived the night, still tended the fire, still passed down knowledge with patience and care, still found room even here for joy at news of a coming child. That combination hardship carried without collapsing beneath it, competence maintained, despite a body already paying a real physical price for decades of demanding labour, may be one of the most quietly remarkable aspects of this entire era, easy to overlook precisely because it produced no dramatic single moment, only the accumulated unglamorous weight of one capable life after another: the fire. Our family tends tonight, burns low but steady carefully, fed carefully, watched, doing exactly the quiet essential work fires like it had done for this household every single night of their lives. Somewhere close by, in the particular darkness of a marsh at the edge of a slowly vanishing coastline, that same steady vigilance is being repeated in countless other shelters by countless other families, each one holding, in its own quiet way, the same patient understanding this story has been building toward all along, that survival here was rarely a single dramatic act. It was this over and over, a small fire kept alive through a long night, a wound watched carefully as it healed, a tooth endured rather than treated, all of it adding up night after night into something that deserves to be recognized honestly for what it actually was. Everything this story has described so far, the marsh, the shelter, the antler front, the chewed piece of birch bark tar, comes from a real place, and it is worth finally saying its name plainly. Archaeologists know this location as Star Car, a site beside what was once a lake in the Vale of Pickering in the north of England, and it stands today as one of the single richest windows anywhere in the world into exactly the kind of life this story has been trying to reconstruct. The site was first properly recognised in the late 1930s when a local man walking the drained peaty fields near the village of Sema noticed worked flint tools scattered across the ground, the unmistakable signature of ancient human activity. Serious excavation began shortly after, led by an archaeologist named Graham Clark, whose careful, methodical work through the middle of the 20th century first revealed the astonishing preservation hiding beneath the surface wood, antler and bone that should by any ordinary expectation have rotted away entirely thousands of years earlier. What Clark and his team had stumbled onto without initially grasping its full scale was a rare, precious kind of archaeological accident, a place where the specific conditions of waterlogged, oxygen-starved peat had acted almost like a vault-sealing organic material away from the bacteria and fungi that would normally break it down within a matter of decades. Ordinary dry ground erases almost everything soft and organic within a human lifetime or two, leaving archaeologists elsewhere to reconstruct entire ways of living from little more than stone tools and the occasional fragment of bone. Star Car offered something categorically different, an environment where wood, antler, plant fibre, and even food remains had simply been waiting undisturbed for 10,000 years. Excavation at Star Car did not end with Clark's original work. Researchers returned to the site repeatedly across the following decades, and a major renewed excavation beginning in the early 2000s, prompted partly by growing concern that changing drainage patterns in the surrounding farmland were finally beginning to threaten the very preservation that had made the site so remarkable, uncovered discoveries that reshaped understanding of the site once again. This concern turned out to be well-founded, and in its own way deeply instructive. The same waterlogged conditions that had protected this material for 10,000 years depend entirely on the ground, remaining saturated, and modern agricultural drainage in the surrounding field had begun lowering the water table, allowing oxygen to reach material that had been sealed away since before the invention of writing. Wood and bone that survived undisturbed for 10 millennia can, once exposed to air and the organisms it carries, begin deteriorating within a matter of years. A sobering reminder that even the most patient, careful preservation the Earth can offer is not infinite, and that a story like this one exists to be told partly because researchers recognize the urgency of recovering what remained before it was lost for good. Among the most significant of these later finds was a wooden platform, a deliberately constructed timber structure, laid down at the edge of the ancient lake built from split timbers worked with real carpentry skill. Researchers studying the tool marks on this wood identified evidence of a woodworking technique considerably more sophisticated than anyone had previously expected from this period, making this platform, according to the most widely accepted current understanding, the oldest known evidence of carpentry anywhere in Europe. It is a genuinely remarkable thing to consider that the family in this story, or their neighbours or their children, may have walked across timber quite literally like this, shaped by careful human hands at the edge of a lake that no longer exists, in a landscape that today looks nothing at all like the one they knew. How do researchers actually know how old any of this is with enough confidence to build a story around it? The primary tool, and one worth explaining honestly rather than simply citing as settled fact, is radiocarbon dating, a method that relies on a naturally occurring, slightly unstable form of carbon absorbed by every living thing throughout its life, whether plant, animal, or human. Once an organism dies, this particular form of carbon begins decaying at a steady, well-understood rate, and by measuring how much of it remains in an organic sample, wood, bone, antler, or even the birch bark tar described earlier in this story, scientists can calculate with a meaningful degree of precision how long ago that organism died. The method has real limits and real margins of error wider the further back in time a sample sits, and archaeologists are careful to present dates as ranges rather than single fixed points. But for a site like Starcar, radiocarbon dating applied across dozens of different samples has allowed researchers to build a remarkably detailed timeline, not just of when people were present at this location, but of roughly how long that presence continued, and how activity may have shifted across different phases of occupation. Radiocarbon dating is only one tool among several that researchers bring to a site this rich, and it is worth briefly naming a few of the others, since each answers a slightly different question about this vanished world. Pollen grains, remarkably durable and present in enormous quantities within the same waterlogged sediment that preserved the wood and antler, allow researchers to reconstruct layer by careful layer exactly which plants and trees grew around this lake at any given point across many centuries, revealing the slow transformation of open, recently glaciated ground into denser woodland as the climate continued warming. Insect remains, tiny beetle fragments in particular, offer their own kind of evidence, since different beetle species tolerate very specific ranges of temperature and moisture, allowing researchers to estimate seasonal conditions with a precision that might otherwise seem impossible to recover after 10,000 years. Taken together, these different threads of evidence, wood, bone, pollen, insect fragments, radiocarbon dates, layered carefully against one another, allow archaeologists to reconstruct not simply a single moment frozen in time, but something closer to a living, changing picture of an entire community's relationship with its landscape across many generations. There is a genuinely surprising detail connected to more recent work at this site that deserves particular mention, and it involves something far smaller and far more intimate than a timber platform. In the year 2015, researchers recovered a small pendant carved from shale roughly the size of a modern coin, deliberately shaped and engraved with a careful pattern of lines. Analysis suggested this pendant was created and used at Starcar itself, making it, according to current understanding, the oldest known piece of Mesolithic art discovered anywhere in Britain. Scholars still debate exactly what the engraved pattern was intended to represent, whether it held personal, decorative, or genuinely symbolic and ritual meaning, since a few scratched lines on ancient shale offer no accompanying explanation of their own significance. But the object itself carries a quiet, undeniable weight regardless of its precise meaning. Someone here, in this exact place at some point during the centuries this community occupied this stretch of lakeshore, took the time to shape and mark a small piece of stone with evident care for a purpose that mattered enough to warrant the effort, a small personal act of meaning-making that has managed to survive across an almost unimaginable span of time. It would be a mistake to imagine that everything recovered from a site like this arrives with obvious self-evident meaning attached, and it is worth being honest about the genuine limits of what even remarkable preservation like this can actually tell us. Archaeologists working at Starkar continue to debate fundamental questions about the community that lived here, including whether occupation was truly permanent year-round, or whether the site instead functioned as a seasonal camp, visited repeatedly across many generations but not necessarily inhabited continuously through every month of the year. Evidence exists supporting both possibilities, and the honest current scholarly position is that the picture likely varied across the many centuries this location remained in use, shifting as the surrounding landscape itself shifted from lake to reed marsh to the drained agricultural land that exists there today. This uncertainty is not a failure of the research. It reflects instead a genuine and admirable caution, a refusal to claim more confidence than the physical evidence actually supports, even when a more definitive answer would make for a tidier story. Even the population size of a settlement like this one remains genuinely difficult to pin down with real confidence. And it is worth explaining why, since the reasoning itself says something important about the honest limits of this kind of research. Unlike a modern settlement, this community left behind no census, no written record of who lived here or how many people called this lakeshore home in any given season. Researchers instead have to reason indirectly from the volume and variety of tools recovered from the scale of the timber platform, from the apparent duration of occupation suggested by radiocarbon dates toward a plausible estimate rather than a precise figure. Different researchers weighing this same indirect evidence somewhat differently have proposed population estimates that vary meaningfully from one another, some suggesting a fairly small, tightly knit group, numbering perhaps in the dozens, others suggesting a larger, more loosely connected community drawing on this location seasonally from a wider surrounding area. This is not a sign of sloppy scholarship, it is simply an honest reflection of how much genuine uncertainty remains embedded in even the richest archaeological record. Once researchers move beyond what the ground can show directly, and begin reasoning toward what that evidence most plausibly implies. What sites like this one ultimately provide beyond any single artifact or timber platform or engraved pendant is something considerably harder to quantify but no less valuable, a kind of permission to imagine this era with real grounded specificity rather than vague generalized assumption. Before excavations like these, popular understanding of this period tended to default toward a flattened, simplified picture. Small groups of people wandering an empty landscape, surviving day to day with little beyond the most basic tools and the barest necessities. What the physical evidence recovered from a single well-preserved location actually reveals is something considerably richer. Sophisticated woodworking, deliberate artistic expression, complex hunting technology, careful craft production, and clear evidence of a community invested enough in this particular stretch of lakeshore to return to it, build upon it, and shape it across many generations. The animal bone assemblage alone, recovered in enormous quantities across decades of excavation, has allowed researchers to reconstruct a remarkably detailed picture of exactly which species this community relied on in roughly what proportions, and even how carcasses were likely processed, information that would be entirely unavailable from stone tools alone, however carefully studied. This is in its own way one of the most valuable functions archaeology can serve. For a story like the one this video has been telling, correcting not the broad emotional truth of how hard this life actually was, since the evidence overwhelmingly supports that difficulty, but the flattened, oversimplified picture of who these people actually were while living through it. They were not simply enduring, they were building, creating, marking meaning onto stone and antler and wood, in a world that gave them every reason to focus purely on survival, and almost no reason by any modern accounting to spend precious time and effort on anything beyond it. And yet they did exactly that repeatedly across many generations, leaving behind entirely by accident a record considerably more human and considerably more moving than a simple account of hardship alone could ever fully capture. Every detail this story has offered so far about the woman, her husband, their daughter, and the child not yet born has been built from exactly this kind of evidence, drawn honestly from what researchers have actually recovered from this single remarkable location, woven together into the shape of one representative family, living through an era that left behind, in the specific case of this particular marsh, an unusually rich and detailed physical record. No single artifact tells us this family's name, or the exact sound of their voices, or the particular details of their individual lives. What the evidence does offer patiently and honestly is the shape of the world they inhabited, detailed enough that a story like this one can be told with real confidence rather than pure invention grounded in wood, bone, antler, and stone, that has waited quietly in cold, waterlogged mud for exactly this kind of careful, patient attention. It's worth remembering, too, that the researchers doing this careful, patient work are themselves part of the story now. Generations removed from the people whose lives they study, bringing their own tools, their own questions, and their own quiet dedication to a single stretch of ancient lakeshore that refuses to fully give up its secrets even after nearly a century of determined attention. But even the richest physical record leaves real gaps, questions the ground itself cannot fully answer, and it is precisely in those gaps where different researchers looking at the same evidence have reached genuinely different conclusions that this story turns next toward the honest, ongoing disagreements among the very people who have spent careers trying to understand exactly what a place like this one actually meant to the people who once called it home. Ask two respected archaeologists what life actually felt like for a family such as the one this story has followed, and you may quite genuinely receive two meaningfully different answers, not because either researcher is careless with the evidence, but because the evidence itself, honestly examined, does not always point in a single unambiguous direction. This is not a weakness particular to this era of history. It is simply what happens whenever careful people examine a genuinely incomplete record and try to reason responsibly toward the most likely truth. And few debates within this particular field carry more weight or more direct bearing on how we should understand the emotional texture of a life like the one in this story than the ongoing disagreement over just how violent this world actually was. For much of the 20th century, popular imagination defaulted to an image of prehistoric life as something close to constant low-grade warfare. Small bands locked in more or less perpetual conflict with their neighbours over hunting ground resources and territory. In more recent decades, this picture has been challenged directly, and the resulting debate remains genuinely unresolved, argued out in academic journals with real intellectual seriousness on more than one side. The stakes of this argument extend well beyond simple historical curiosity, since how researchers answer this question shapes broader, more consequential arguments about human nature itself, whether cooperation or conflict represents the more fundamental default state of a species left largely to its own devices. Questions that inevitably echo into modern conversations about everything from criminal justice to international relations. However far removed those conversations may feel from a single marsh in ancient Yorkshire, researchers who argue for relatively high levels of prehistoric violence point to specific hard physical evidence. skeletal remains bearing clear signs of lethal trauma, embedded projectile points, defensive wounds, injuries consistent with organized conflict rather than isolated accident. One site in particular, discovered at a place called Nataruk, near a former lakeshore in what is now Kenya, and dated to roughly this same broad era, preserved the remains of an entire group of individuals, men, women, and children among them, showing clear evidence of violent death, some with bindings still apparently in place, others struck by projectiles whose stone tips remained lodged in the bone. Researchers who take the site as broadly representative argue it demonstrates that organized lethal violence between human groups existed well before the rise of farming cities or formal states, undermining any assumption that warfare is purely a modern invention layered onto an originally peaceful species. Proponents of this view often point additionally to certain patterns of comparative evidence gathered from more recently studied hunter-gatherer societies where documented rates of violent death in a meaningful number of cases have measured surprisingly high when calculated as a proportion of total population, higher in some comparative studies than casualty rates suffered by many societies during even the deadliest wars of the modern era. A striking and genuinely uncomfortable statistic that researchers on this side of the debate treat as suggestive if not conclusive evidence about the deeper past. Other researchers examining this same body of evidence urge real caution before drawing sweeping conclusions from it, and their objections deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. A single site, however striking, does not necessarily represent a typical experience across an entire era and an entire planet's worth of human communities. Critics of the high violence interpretation point out that skeletal evidence of violent death, while genuinely present at certain sites, remains comparatively rare across the broader archaeological record of this period taken as a whole, and that surviving evidence may be skewed by which remains happen to preserve well and which sites happen to attract careful modern excavation. They further argue that the comparative statistics drawn from more recently studied hunter-gatherer societies deserve real scrutiny of their own, since many of those societies were themselves already living under significant pressure from colonial expansion, resource competition with encroaching outside groups, and disrupted territory at the time. They were studied conditions that may have elevated rates of conflict well beyond whatever baseline existed in a genuinely undisturbed prehistoric world. Applying statistics gathered under those particular historically fraught circumstances directly onto a community like the one at Starkar, they argue risks projecting a distorted, unrepresentative picture backward onto a very different set of circumstances entirely. They argue that a single dramatic episode of violence, however real and however tragic for the people involved, cannot responsibly be extrapolated into a general rule about how communities across the entire globe typically related to one another during this era. Scholars still debate this question actively without any clear resolution currently in sight, and the honest current position within the field is best described not as settled fact in either direction, but as a genuine ongoing argument between researchers who agree on the physical evidence itself and disagree meaningfully about how representative that evidence actually is. What might this mean then for a family like the one we've been following throughout this story? It would be dishonest to claim certainty either way. It is entirely possible that a community like this one lived its entire existence without ever experiencing organized violence directed at them by another group of people, relying instead on the cooperative networks of exchange and mutual support already described earlier in this story. It is also entirely possible, and the evidence from sites like Nataruk makes clear that it cannot be dismissed, that conflict between neighbouring groups, whether over resources, territory, or grievances now impossible to reconstruct, represented a real, if perhaps occasional, danger alongside everything else this world already demanded of its people. The honest answer, the one this channel is committed to giving rather than a tidier alternative, is that we genuinely do not know with confidence which of these pictures better describes the particular family whose story this has been, and pretending otherwise would misrepresent exactly the kind of careful evidence-based history this story has tried to offer from its very beginning. There is a second genuine debate worth bringing into this story, one that touches something this narrative has until now presented with more confidence than the evidence may fully justify, and it concerns the division of labour between men and women in communities like this one. This story, like most popular tellings of this era, has generally followed a familiar pattern, describing the hunt as primarily the work of men while framing gathering, food processing, and childcare as primarily the work of women. This pattern reflects a long-standing assumption within the field, sometimes called the man-the-hunter model, built originally on a combination of ethnographic comparison with more recent hunter-gatherer societies and a reading of skeletal evidence that seemed for decades to support a fairly rigid division along these lines. That assumption has come under real serious challenge in recent years, and the challenge deserves genuine attention rather than a passing mention. A widely discussed study published in the year 2020 examined a burial from a high-altitude site in what is now Peru, dated to a broadly similar era to the one this story describes, and found a young adult female buried alongside a substantial kit of hunting tools, including projectile points and implements consistent with big game processing, arranged in a manner closely mirroring burials that had in the past been automatically assumed to belong to male hunters, based on their associated grave goods alone. Following this discovery, the same research team reviewed previously excavated burials from similar sites across the wider region and identified a meaningful number of additional cases where earlier assumptions about a burial's sex may be informally based on associated hunting equipment rather than careful skeletal analysis turned out on closer forensic examination to be simply wrong. It's worth pausing on exactly how those earlier assumptions were made in the first place, because the underlying pattern is genuinely instructive. For much of the history of this field, researchers excavating a burial containing hunting equipment tended to assume, often without extensive skeletal analysis, to confirm it that the individual buried there was male, since the prevailing cultural framework of the time simply took male hunting as the unquestioned default. Skeletal analysis capable of determining biological sex with real confidence exists and has existed for decades, but it requires careful examination of specific bone structures, particularly around the pelvis and skull work, that takes real time, and was not always prioritized when a burial's associated grave goods seemed on the surface to already answer the question. This meant that for a significant stretch of the field's history, an entire category of assumption went largely unchecked, not through any deliberate intent to mislead, but through the quiet compounding effect of an unexamined cultural expectation shaping which questions researchers thought to ask in the first place. This is a genuinely important detail worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past, because it illustrates something valuable about how historical understanding actually improves over time, not through a single dramatic discovery overturning everything at once, but through careful repeated correction of assumptions that had for too long gone unexamined. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread female participation in big game hunting actually was across different regions and different communities of this broad era, since the evidence remains genuinely limited and unevenly distributed across different sites, and it would be its own kind of overcorrection to simply reverse the old assumption into an equally rigid new one. What the evidence does support with reasonable confidence is that the division of labour in communities like this one was very likely more flexible, more varied by circumstance and by individual capability than the tidy categorical picture popular imagination has long assumed. Some researchers point out reasonably that pregnancy, prolonged nursing, and the physical demands of caring for very young children would still have shaped in practical terms how often and how far any individual woman could travel on a demanding, multi-day hunting expedition, meaning flexibility likely coexisted alongside real biologically grounded constraint, rather than either extreme rigid division or complete interchangeability fully capturing the actual lived complexity of the arrangement. Is it worth wondering, then, whether the woman at the centre of this story might herself have hunted alongside her husband at some point in her life before her daughter was born, before this second pregnancy, perhaps even after, depending on how her own community handled such questions? The honest answer is that we cannot say with certainty, and this story has chosen for the sake of narrative clarity to follow a fairly traditional division of roles between its central figures. But it is worth acknowledging plainly that this choice reflects a storytelling decision as much as a settled historical fact, and that the real communities living through this era very likely included real variation families and individuals who organized their labor differently, depending on skill, circumstance, and preference in ways the archaeological record is only now beginning to recover with real clarity. What both of these debates share, the question of violence and the question of gendered labor, is a broader lesson about how history like this should actually be approached, one this channel takes seriously as a matter of real principle rather than mere caution. The temptation when telling a story meant to feel emotionally coherent and complete is to smooth over exactly this kind of genuine uncertainty, choosing whichever answer makes for the more satisfying narrative, and presenting it with more confidence than the evidence actually supports. Resisting that temptation, sitting honestly with the parts of this story that remain genuinely unresolved, is not a failure of storytelling. It is, if anything, a deeper form of respect, both for the real people this story is trying to honor, and for the listener trusting this channel to tell them what is actually known, clearly separated from what remains. Even now, an open and active question. There is a third area of genuine scholarly disagreement worth naming, briefly quieter than the previous two, but no less revealing of how much this field continues to evolve, and it concerns the actual quality of daily life this era offered compared to what came immediately after it. A particular line of argument associated with researchers examining skeletal health across the broader transition from hunting and gathering toward early farming has suggested that communities relying on hunting, fishing and gathering communities very much like the one at the centre of this story may actually have enjoyed measurably better nutrition, greater dietary variety, and in some studied cases fewer signs of chronic disease than the farming communities that eventually followed them in the same regions. This runs directly against a common intuitive assumption that farming represented a straightforward improvement in human well-being, a steady march from hardship towards security. Other researchers push back meaningfully against drawing too broad a conclusion from this pattern, pointing out that the transition to farming unfolded very differently across different regions and different timescales, and that whatever short-term health costs early farming may have introduced in certain specific well-studied populations the long-term trajectory. It eventually enabled larger, more stable food surpluses, permanent settlement, and everything that followed from it across the subsequent millennia complicates any simple verdict about which way of life was on balance genuinely better for the people living through it. This debate, like the others, remains active and unresolved, argued with real seriousness by researchers examining the same underlying skeletal evidence and reaching meaningfully different conclusions about what it actually demonstrates. The evidence surrounding this family and the era they represent will likely keep shifting in exactly this way, for as long as researchers continue returning to sites like Starkar and Natruk with new questions and new techniques, each fresh excavation season carrying the real possibility of quietly overturning something the field had until recently taken for granted. That is not a weakness in how this story has been told. It is in its own way one of the more genuinely hopeful aspects of the entire discipline. A field willing to correct itself patiently and honestly whenever the ground offers up a reason to do so. and it leaves this story even now with a final and considerably heavier question still waiting to be answered one. This narrative has been circling from its very first moment beside that small marsh fire, concerning not how this family lived, but what all of this taken together eventually cost them. Far to the southeast of the marsh, our family calls home well beyond any distance their own trading networks could realistically span. Something was beginning to happen that would eventually reshape human life more completely than anything else described in this story so far. And it began as so much in this era did quietly, without any single dramatic moment marking its true beginning. Earlier in this story, brief mention was made of communities in a region that would one day be called the Near East, already experimenting with tending wild grains more deliberately than any hunting society before them had needed to. It is worth returning to that thread now properly, because what grew out of those early experiments represents one of the genuine hinge points in the entire span of human history. A change so fundamental that nearly everything about how most people alive today actually live can be traced back in one way or another to what began unfolding in this particular region during roughly the same broad era. The place in question sits within a wide arc of fertile land stretching from the eastern Mediterranean coast through the hill country of what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, down along the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into what is now Iraq, a region researchers often call the Fertile Crescent for the simple reason that its combination of climate, soil, and available wild plant life made it unusually well suited for exactly the kind of experimentation that was, at this point, only just beginning. Wild wheat and barley grew here in genuinely dense harvestable stands. Wild sheep and goats moved through the surrounding hills in the populations large enough to make sustained observation and eventually active management genuinely feasible in a way it simply was not for our marsh-dwelling family's own local herds of deer and wild cattle. It's worth pausing here to note something easy to overlook, which is how different this landscape actually was from the one our family knows. Where the marsh-dwelling family lived among reed beds, tidal channels, and the low wet ground of a slowly drowning coastline. This region to the southeast offered rolling hills, distinct wet and dry seasons, and crucially wild cereal grasses growing in such dense natural stands that a single skilled forager, using nothing more than a simple cutting tool, could reportedly gather enough wild grain in a few concentrated weeks of the year to meaningfully support a household for many months afterward. This natural abundance, concentrated so heavily within a narrow harvesting season, appears to have encouraged exactly the kind of sustained, repeated attention to particular stands of plants that eventually tipped slowly and without any single decisive moment into active management and eventually true cultivation. There is a discovery from this broader region that tends to upend nearly everyone's assumptions about how this transformation actually unfolded, and it deserves real attention here. At a site called Göbekli Tepe in the hill country of what is now southeastern Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered a series of massive stone structures, enormous carved limestone pillars, some standing taller than a person, arranged in careful circular formations and decorated with detailed relief carvings of animals, foxes, boars, birds, and other creatures rendered with genuine artistic sophistication. Radiocarbon dating places construction of the earliest of these structures at roughly 11,500 years before the present, which places it slightly earlier than and broadly contemporary with the world our marsh family inhabits. What makes this site so genuinely startling is not simply its age or its scale, though both are remarkable, but the fact that the people who built it were by every indication currently available. Still hunter-gatherers without domesticated crops or animals without permanent villages of the kind that later became common across this region. This finding directly challenged a long-standing assumption that had shaped archaeological thinking for generations. The assumption that large-scale organized construction projects like this one could only emerge after farming had already produced the food surplus and settled population necessary to support them. Göbekli Tepe suggests, at least to many researchers studying it, the opposite possibility, that the desire to gather regularly at a shared significant site, perhaps for ceremonial or religious purposes, we can only partially reconstruct, may have been part of what motivated people to begin managing wild grain more intensively in the first place, since feeding a large gathering of people returning repeatedly to the same location would have created genuine pressure to secure a more reliable, concentrated food source nearby. Scholars still debate this interpretation actively, since establishing a clear causal direction from archaeological evidence, this old remains genuinely difficult, and other researchers argue for a more traditional sequence, with population pressure and environmental change driving agricultural experimentation independently of any ceremonial gathering site. What is not in dispute is that this single site has forced the entire field to hold its previous assumptions more loosely, a useful reminder that even a transformation as significant as the origin of farming did not necessarily unfold in the single tidy order popular imagination has long assumed. Whatever the precise sequence, the underlying shift itself, once it began accelerating across the generations following our family's own lifetime, proceeded with a momentum that is worth describing honestly, because it did not happen quickly by any human timescale, and it did not happen because anyone involved set out with a deliberate plan to invent farming as we would recognize it today. Communities in this region had already been managing and encouraging useful wild plants for many generations, clearing competing growth, favoring particularly productive individual plants, returning reliably to the same stands of wild grain season after season. Over time, this kind of sustained informal management began producing measurable changes in the plants themselves, a process modern researchers can trace directly in the archaeological record through subtle shifts in seed size and structure. Wild wheat, for instance, evolved to shatter its seed heads easily once ripe, scattering seeds widely across the ground to ensure the plant's own natural reproduction. Humans repeatedly harvesting this grain, whether consciously or not, favored the rarer individual plants whose seed heads happened to hold together a little longer, since those were the plants still bearing harvestable grain by the time a harvester actually arrived. Across many generations of this quiet repeated selection, populations of wheat and barley in this region gradually shifted towards forms that retain their seeds far more readily, a genuine physical transformation of the plant itself, driven not by any single deliberate breeding decision, but by the accumulated, patient pressure of human harvesting habits repeated across an enormous span of time. Researchers studying this process have been able to trace it with real precision by examining thousands of individual ancient grain fragments recovered from a sequence of excavated settlements spanning many centuries, measuring the proportion of shattering versus non-shattering seed heads present at each successive layer. What this careful, painstaking work reveals is not a single moment of domestication, but a long, gradual curve. Non-shattering plants, representing only a small minority of the total harvest in the earliest layers, slowly increasing in proportion generation after generation before, finally, after what researchers estimate to be several centuries of this quiet accumulation, coming to dominate the harvest entirely. It is a genuinely humbling thing to consider that one of the most consequential transformations in the entire history of our species unfolded not through any single insight or decision, but through the simple repeated accumulation of an enormous number of small, largely unconscious choices made by ordinary people gathering food exactly the way their parents had taught them to, across more generations than any single family history could ever fully hold in memory. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes something that popular imagination often gets slightly wrong about this era. The shift toward farming was not in its earliest phases a sudden invention or a single moment of insight. It was closer to an extended, largely unconscious negotiation between human communities and the plants they depended on unfolding across centuries rather than years, each generation inheriting a slightly more manageable, slightly more productive version of the same wild grain their parents and grandparents had gathered before them without necessarily perceiving the cumulative scale of the change taking shape beneath their hands. What did all of this eventually cost the people living through it? Once settled, farming communities began establishing themselves across this region in earnest. This is where the story turns genuinely sobering and where honest evidence complicates any simple narrative of straightforward progress. Skeletal remains recovered from early farming settlements across this broader region show clear signs that this transition, whatever long-term benefits it eventually enabled, carried real, immediate costs for many of the people who lived through its earliest phases. Reliance on a narrower range of staple crops, compared to the genuinely varied diet available to a hunting and gathering community with access to dozens of different wild food sources across an entire landscape, appears in the skeletal record as increased evidence of nutritional deficiency and dental disease driven partly by the sheer volume of starchy grain in the diet. Permanent, denser settlement, living for the first time in fixed communities alongside stored grain, domesticated animals, and accumulated human and animal waste, created entirely new conditions for the spread of infectious disease conditions that simply did not exist in the same way for smaller, more mobile communities like the one our story has been following, who moved seasonally across a landscape and left behind in any single location. Far less accumulated waste and far fewer opportunities for disease to establish itself and spread readily between people living in close permanent proximity. There is a genuinely important detail connected to this that deserves particular attention because it touches directly on something that would go on to shape enormous stretches of subsequent human history. Living in close sustained contact with domesticated animals, sheep, goats, cattle, and eventually others exposed early farming communities to a category of disease that simply had far fewer opportunities to develop among people living the kind of life our marsh-dwelling family knew. A number of diseases that would go on to cause devastating epidemics across human history, including illnesses whose origins trace back to close contact with cattle and other livestock, appear to have made their initial jump from animal populations into human ones precisely during this period of increasingly close sustained cohabitation between people and the animals they had begun to domesticate. This does not mean disease was absent from hunting and gathering communities, since illness of many kinds has surely accompanied human beings for as long as human beings have existed. But the specific category of disease that jumps from domesticated animals into human populations and that can then spread efficiently between people living in dense settled communities represents something genuinely new entering the broader human story at roughly this point, a direct, largely unintended consequence of the very innovation that would eventually allow human populations to grow far larger than hunting and gathering alone could ever have supported. It would be a mistake hearing all of this to conclude that farming represented a simple mistake, a wrong turn human communities somehow should have avoided. That framing does not hold up against the honest weight of what followed. Whatever the real immediate costs borne by the earliest generations of farmers, the surplus that settled agriculture eventually made possible unreliable and hard-won at first, but capable over subsequent centuries, of supporting populations far denser than any hunting and gathering landscape ever could set in motion. Nearly everything that followed across the subsequent span of human history, permanent settlements growing into towns and eventually cities, specialized crafts and trades no longer requiring every single person to spend most of their time directly securing food, the eventual development of writing, record keeping, and the vast, cumulative architecture of human civilization that followed from it. None of that would have been possible without this slow, halting, costly transition beginning here in this particular region at roughly this particular moment. Is it fair then to ask whether the people living through this transition generation after generation of farmers, absorbing real immediate cost to their own health and daily comfort, ever received anything resembling a full accounting of what their sacrifice would eventually purchase for descendants they would never meet? It is a genuinely uncomfortable question, and honesty requires admitting that the answer is almost certainly no. The farmers whose skeletons show the dental disease and nutritional strain described earlier in this story were not investing in some distant future they could clearly foresee. They were simply living their own lives, making the best decisions available to them with the knowledge and resources they actually had, exactly as our marsh-dwelling family was doing at roughly the same moment, thousands of miles and an entirely different way of life away. Neither group could have known which choices history would eventually judge as pivotal, and neither group was making those choices with any such judgment in mind. This is perhaps one of the more genuinely humbling truths this entire story has to offer, that the vast, sweeping changes we now narrate with the comfortable clarity of hindsight were to the people actually living through them simply the accumulated texture of ordinary life met one day at a time, without any privileged view of where it was all eventually leading. And yet for the family whose story this has been, none of this represented an immediate reality. The marsh, the antler frontlets, the aurochs, hunt the fire tended carefully through cold nights, all of it continued for many generations, yet, in this particular corner of the world largely untouched by what was beginning to unfold so far to the southeast. Farming would not reach the landscape our family calls home for many centuries, still arriving gradually eventually, carried by movement of people and ideas across a very long span of time, transforming this coastline too in its own eventual season. But that transformation belonged to a different story told across different generations, and it is worth honouring the particular complete life our family actually lived on its own terms rather than reading it forward too quickly into changes they themselves could not have known were coming. What remains then, once this story turns its attention back toward this single family? One last time is the question of what actually became of them. What traces, if any, an ordinary life like theirs managed to leave behind across the 10,000 years separating that morning beside the marsh from the moment this story is being told to you now? And it is to that quiet, lingering question that this story turns next. A face looked back at researchers in the year 2018 that none of them had quite expected, and the story of how it came to be reconstructed offers one of the more genuinely startling ways this ancient world still reaches directly into our own. The skeleton itself, discovered decades earlier in a cave in the southwest of England, and known somewhat informally as Cheddar Man's, had been sitting in a museum collection for many years, its age already established through radiocarbon dating at roughly 10,000 years, placing this individual squarely within the same broad era our marsh-dwelling family belongs to, and likely connected to a broadly similar population of hunter-gatherers living across the wider landscape of what is now Britain. The cave itself, part of a dramatic limestone gorge that draws visitors from around the world today, had already yielded human remains decades before Cheddar Man's discovery, but it was this particular skeleton, remarkably complete and remarkably well preserved by the cool, stable conditions deep within the cave system, that would eventually offer researchers their clearest possible window into this individual's actual physical appearance. What changed in the year 2018 was not the skeleton itself, but what researchers were finally able to extract from it. Advances in ancient deoxyribonucleic acid analysis techniques that had simply not existed when this skeleton was first excavated allowed scientists to recover and sequence genetic material preserved inside the skull, reconstructing with real scientific confidence physical characteristics this individual actually carried during his lifetime. This kind of analysis requires extracting genetic material so fragile and so degraded by 10,000 years underground that researchers must work in specially controlled laboratory conditions, guarding constantly against contamination from modern human deoxyribonucleic acid, which is present essentially everywhere, including on the hands and breath of the very scientists conducting the analysis. The fact that any usable genetic material survived at all, let alone enough to reconstruct specific physical traits with real confidence, represents a genuine triumph of patient laboratory technique built up gradually over several decades of methodological refinement. The results surprised nearly everyone who saw them, including many of the researchers involved. Genetic markers associated with skin pigmentation indicated that Cheddar Man likely had notably dark skin, considerably darker than the pale complexion popular imagination had long assumed for ancient inhabitants of Britain, while separate genetic markers indicated he almost certainly had blue eyes, a combination that ran directly against a common, unexamined assumption that had shaped popular understanding of this era for generations. This finding generated real public conversation and inevitably some public disagreement, since it directly overturned an image many people had carried without ever pausing to question where that image had actually come from. Scholars are careful to note that reconstructing precise skin tone from ancient genetic material still involves a meaningful degree of interpretation, and that individual variation within any ancient population would have existed just as it does today, meaning Cheddar Man's specific combination of features should not be read as a single uniform template for every person alive in Britain during this period. But the broader genetic pattern has remained revealed that pale skin as the default expected appearance across Northern Europe emerged considerably later than most people assume, following its own separate evolutionary story tied to later population movements and dietary shifts. Stands as one of the more quietly significant corrections this field has offered in recent years. What makes this discovery matter for the story we have been telling tonight is not simply its surprising specifics, but what it reveals about a broader, remarkable truth that the people living through this era are not entirely lost to us in the way we might assume. Their bones can still even now be read with enough precision to reconstruct details as intimate and specific as the colour of their eyes. A level of connection across 10,000 years that would have seemed like pure fantasy to researchers working even a single generation ago. There is a second thread connecting this ancient world directly to the present one, considerably more physical and considerably less expected, and it involves the very stretch of drowned land this story has already spent real time describing. Doggerland, the once dry expanse connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Before rising seas slowly claimed, it did not simply vanish from human contact once it disappeared beneath the water. For well over a century, fishing trawlers working the North Sea have periodically dragged up genuine fragments of this lost world in their nets alongside the fish they were actually seeking. Worked flint tools, fragments of antler shaped by human hands, and the bones of animals that no longer exist anywhere on Earth, including mammoth tusks and the remains of woolly rhinoceros, have surfaced this way with real if unpredictable regularity, hauled up from the seabed by fishermen who for generations often had little idea what they were actually looking at. Some of this material found its way almost by accident into private collections and local museums long before researchers began systematically studying it, and it is only in more recent decades that scientists have started working directly with fishing communities, examining trawled material with real archaeological rigor, piecing together fragment by fragment an increasingly detailed picture of the landscape that once lay beneath what is now open water. This working relationship between researchers and fishing crews has itself become something worth describing, since it represents a genuinely unusual form of scientific collaboration. Trawler crews working these waters for decades often developed an informal practical familiarity with which stretches of seabed tended to produce unusual finds, knowledge passed down among crews, much the way this story earlier described knowledge passing between generations of hunters on dry land, though separated from that older tradition by 10,000 years, and an entirely different relationship to the same physical landscape. Researchers eventually began actively soliciting reports from these crews, offering to examine anything unusual pulled up in a net, rather than simply discarded as debris, and this partnership has meaningfully expanded the catalogue of known material recovered from the drowned landscape, adding new pieces to the picture with each passing fishing season, entirely dependent on the chance timing of where a particular vessel happened to drag its net on a particular day. Is it not a genuinely strange thing to consider that somewhere beneath the surface of the modern North Sea, in the cold dark water, crossed daily by ferries and cargo ships, the physical remains of the very world our marsh-dwelling family inhabited, still rest scattered and largely unexamined, waiting for the occasional accident of a fishing net to bring some small fragment of it briefly back into human hands. It is a genuinely remarkable image, this ancient, vanished coastline continuing to offer up small, unpredictable pieces of itself across so many centuries, entirely indifferent to the modern industry now operating directly above it. Researchers estimate that only a small fraction of what remains on the seabed has ever been recovered or even properly surveyed, meaning the drowned landscape our family once walked continues even now to hold far more than it has yet chosen to reveal. The connection between this ancient population and the people living across Britain and much of Europe today runs deeper still, embedded not simply in isolated discoveries like Cheddar Man or scattered artifacts pulled from the seabed, but directly within the genetic makeup of enormous numbers of people alive right now. Researchers studying ancient and modern genetic material together have identified a distinct genetic signature associated with the broader population of hunter-gatherers who lived across Western Europe during this general era, a signature scientists sometimes refer to as Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. This signature did not disappear when farming eventually arrived in this region many centuries later. Instead, it blended gradually and unevenly with the genetic contributions of farming populations who migrated into the region from the southeast, and later still with genetic contributions from other population movements across the following millennia, producing the genetically layered population that exists across modern Europe today. The methods behind this kind of research deserve a moment of honest explanation, since the underlying science is genuinely remarkable. Researchers compare genetic material extracted from ancient skeletal remains, samples like the one recovered from Cheddar Man, against the genomes of tens of thousands of modern individuals who have voluntarily contributed their own genetic information to large-scale research databases, searching for shared patterns, specific genetic markers that appear consistently in both ancient hunter-gatherer remains and in modern populations in proportions that vary meaningfully depending on region and ancestry. This comparison allows researchers to estimate with growing statistical confidence, as sample sizes continue expanding, roughly what proportion of any given modern individual's genetic inheritance traces back to populations like the one at Starkar, as opposed to later farming populations or subsequent waves of migration that arrived across the following millennia. Scholars still debate the precise proportions of this ancestral blending across different regions and different modern populations, since the process unfolded differently in different places and across a very long span of time, and reconstructing exact percentages from ancient genetic samples remains an active, ongoing area of research rather than fully solved. Early estimates of hunter-gatherer genetic contribution to modern British and broader European populations have themselves shifted somewhat as sample sizes have grown and analytical methods have improved. A reminder that even genetic research, for all its apparent precision, continues to refine itself the same way every other branch of this field does, through patient accumulation of evidence rather than a single final answer arriving all at once. What is not in dispute is the underlying reality itself that a meaningful portion of the genetic inheritance carried by people living across Britain and much of Europe today traces directly back to populations very much like the one our marsh-dwelling family belonged to, carried forward generation after generation through an unbroken chain of descent stretching across 10,000 years entirely without the knowledge or awareness of any single person along that chain. This is worth sitting with gently because it offers something this story has been quietly building toward from its very first moment beside that small marsh fire. The woman we have been following, her husband, her daughter, and the child not yet born, were never simply distant historical figures disconnected from the world of the person listening to this story right now. If genetic descent from populations like theirs runs as broadly through modern European populations as current research suggests, then it is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that someone listening to this story tonight carries quietly present within their own cells a genuine biological thread connecting them directly back to people who lived exactly this kind of life, tending exactly this kind of fire, facing exactly this kind of uncertain morning. There is a final, quieter form of legacy worth naming before this story moves toward its close, one that lives not in genetics or artifacts, but in something closer to inherited disposition. Researchers studying human physiology and psychology have long noted that many of the instincts and responses that shaped survival for people like our marsh-dwelling family remain deeply embedded in human beings today, largely unchanged by the comparatively recent and evolutionarily brief arrival of modern comfort and safety. The particular alertness a person feels waking in an unfamiliar dark room, the instinctive comfort drawn from the sight and warmth of an open fire, the deep evolved preference for foods rich in fat and sugar that once represented genuine nutritional value in a world of real scarcity, but now in a world of genuine abundance can work against rather than for a person's well-being. All of these represent inherited traces of exactly the kind of world this story has spent so long describing, carried forward not through conscious memory, since no memory could possibly survive 10,000 years, but through the slower, quieter mechanism of evolved instinct passed down through body and behavior long after the specific dangers that originally shaped them had faded into distant, unrecoverable history. Consider, for instance, something as ordinary as the particular comfort so many people report feeling near an open flame, whether a fireplace, a campfire, or even the modest contained flicker of a candle on an evening table. This response appears remarkably consistent across an enormous range of cultures and circumstances, suggesting something considerably deeper than simple aesthetic preference or cultural habit. Researchers studying this pattern have proposed that this response may represent a genuine evolutionary inheritance, a nervous system quite literally shaped across hundreds of thousands of years of human history to register the sight and warmth of controlled fire as a signal of safety, since for nearly the entire span of human existence, attended fire meant exactly what it meant for our marsh-dwelling family: protection from cold, from darkness, from the predators and dangers that fire reliably helped keep at bay. A modern person relaxing beside a fireplace on an ordinary evening is in a very real physiological sense drawing on the same deep inherited comfort that once helped an entire household settle safely into sleep beside a carefully tended fire at the edge of an ancient marsh. This same evolutionary lag helps explain, at least in part, why certain modern experiences can feel disproportionately unsettling, even when no genuine danger is actually present. A sudden unexpected sound in an otherwise quiet house, an unfamiliar shape glimpsed briefly at the edge of vision, an unlit street at night can trigger a genuine, measurable physiological alarm response in a modern person, living in circumstances of real statistical safety, precisely because the underlying nervous system generating that response was shaped across an almost unimaginably long span of time, during which exactly this kind of uncertainty, a sound in the dark, an unexpected movement genuinely did represent meaningful danger, the kind our marsh-dwelling family navigated as an ordinary, unremarkable feature of daily life. Understanding this inherited wiring does not make the modern experience of anxiety or unease any less real, but it does offer a kind of quiet, useful context, a reminder that certain feelings arriving without an obvious modern cause may simply be an old, patient inheritance doing exactly what it was originally built to do, long after the world around it changed beyond all recognition. None of this means a modern listener should imagine themselves as somehow still living inside the dangers this story has described. The world has changed immeasurably since the morning this story began, and nearly every specific threat this family faced, the hunger gap, the risk of untreated infection, the danger of childbirth without modern medical support, has been genuinely dramatically reduced for enormous numbers of people alive today, a fact worth acknowledging honestly and with real gratitude rather than glossing over in service of a tidier historical narrative. But the underlying architecture of the human body and mind, the instincts, the fears, the particular comfort drawn from warmth, safety, and the presence of people we trust remains recognizably, genuinely continuous with the world. This family actually inhabited a quiet, persistent inheritance carried forward across every single generation, standing between that ancient morning and the one you yourself will wake into next. What remains now, having traced this story from a single uncertain morning beside a marsh through hunt and hunger, through evidence and honest scholarly disagreement, through the vast transformation beginning so far to the southeast and finally into the quiet, persistent traces, this ancient world still leaves inside every person. Listening tonight is simply the ending itself, the closing of this particular story and the settling of everything it has carried gently into rest. There is no gravestone for the woman at the center of this story. No carved marker anyone could visit, no name recorded anywhere a person could read it aloud. And yet somehow across every part of this story tonight she has remained entirely stubbornly present in the fire. She checked each morning in the child she carried, and the one already sleeping beside her in the antler, worn by a hunter moving carefully through the reeds, in a small piece of chewed pitch set down beside a lake and never picked back up. It is worth pausing here before this story closes to hold all of these pieces together at once, because that is in the end what a single human life actually is. Not one dramatic event, but exactly this, an accumulation of small, ordinary moments, most of them unremarkable at the time that together add up to something that deserves to be called a life. There is a pattern worth naming honestly before this story closes, one this channel returns to again and again across the many stories it tells, because it appears to be true. Almost everywhere history has been examined closely enough to see it clearly. Power, when it appears in the human story at all, is fragile, contested, and temporary, rising and falling across timescales that feel enormous to the people living through them, and vanishingly brief when viewed from any real historical distance. But underneath power, beneath every empire and every collapse this channel has told or will ever tell sits something considerably more durable. The quiet, largely unrecorded work of ordinary people simply trying to get their families safely through one more season. That work rarely makes it into the grand historical record in its own right. It survives instead in exactly the kind of evidence this story has spent so long describing: bones tools, a wooden platform laid carefully across wet ground, a piece of chewed pitch discarded without a second thought. There is a certain kind of arrogance, understandable but ultimately mistaken, in assuming that the people who leave behind the loudest, most visible record of themselves were necessarily the ones whose lives mattered most. History as it is usually taught follows the trail of visible power almost by default, simply because visible power tends to leave visible evidence, inscriptions, monuments, chronicles commissioned by rulers eager to be remembered favourably. Ordinary people, by contrast, leave behind evidence that requires considerably more patience to find and considerably more humility to properly interpret a discarded tool, a healed bone, a hearth swept clean, one final time before its family moved on or simply stopped returning. A story like this one exists precisely to correct that imbalance in whatever small way a single video reasonably can, insisting that the family beside this marsh deserves exactly the same careful, patient attention as any king or conqueror this channel might otherwise choose to tell. It is worth stating this pattern plainly because it is easy, hearing story after story of rulers and empires and dramatic collapse, to begin mistaking the loud, well-documented parts of history for the whole of it. Kings rise, kings fall, cities are built with tremendous effort and sometimes abandoned within a single lifetime. Entire systems of belief and governance that once seemed permanent to the people living inside them have again and again across the long span of human history simply dissolved, leaving behind ruins that later generations walk through without fully understanding what they are looking at. Against that backdrop, a single family beside a marsh with no throne, no monument, no written record of any kind might seem at first glance like the least significant thread in the entire fabric of human history. But hold that thought against everything this story has actually shown across its telling tonight, and a different picture begins to emerge. The empires rise and fall, the families endure generation folding into generation, an unbroken chain of ordinary effort stretching back farther than any throne has ever managed to stand. It is not power that has carried the human story this far, it is precisely this love, competence, care passed patiently from one person to the next, quiet enough to leave almost no mark on the historical record and durable enough to have never once actually stopped. Consider too what this family's story shares with every other story this channel has told and with every other story it will eventually tell. Whether the subject is a vanished civilization, a forgotten massacre, or a single ordinary household beside a marsh, the same underlying human truths keep surfacing again and again, regardless of century or continent. People facing genuine danger nonetheless choose over and over to build, to teach, to love, to hope, because the alternative, simply waiting passively for whatever comes, has never actually been how human beings live, even in the hardest circumstances imaginable. Communities absorb one another's losses rather than leaving the weakest to fend entirely for themselves, not out of pure altruism, but because cooperation has always been at its core one of the most effective survival strategies our species has ever developed. And knowledge hard won and carefully tested gets passed forward imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently from one generation to the next, because the alternative, watching each new generation begin entirely from nothing, would have doomed this species long before any of its stories could ever have been told. None of this required a grand ambition to sustain itself, and that may be the most important thing this story can leave behind. A household did not need to imagine itself as part of some larger historical arc to make the small patient choices that carried it forward, tending a fire, teaching a child, staying beside someone through a difficult recovery. Those choices were simply what love looked like expressed through the only means this world actually offered: attention, effort, and time given freely to the people who mattered most. Multiply that single household by every other household. Living through this same broad era across every continent, this story has touched even briefly tonight, and the true scale of what this period actually contained comes into clearer focus. Not a single dramatic narrative, but an almost uncountable number of small private ones running in parallel, each one just as complete, just as consequential to the people living it as the one this particular story chose to follow. There is too a quieter kind of collapse woven through this particular story, easy to overlook beside the louder collapses. This channel more often tells, but genuinely worth naming before this story closes. The world our family called home did not survive intact. Doggerland disappeared entirely beneath the sea within a handful of generations of their own lifetime. The marsh itself, the reeds, the channels, the particular stretch of lakeshore that shaped every single detail of how this family lived, was drained, farmed, and reshaped almost beyond recognition across the many centuries that followed, existing today, mostly as flat, ordinary agricultural land in the north of England, indistinguishable to a casual visitor from countless other fields nearby. In its own quiet, unspectacular way, this too was a kind of ending, a world that once felt to the people living inside it as permanent and unshakable as any empire ever has, eventually giving way entirely to something else. Collapse, this story suggests, does not always arrive as conquest or catastrophe. Sometimes it simply arrives as centuries patiently accumulating until the world a person once knew intimately no longer exists anywhere except in the ground beneath a farmer's boots. And yet memory of a kind persisted anyway, though not in the form most people usually mean when they use that word. No one alive today remembers this woman's name, her voice, the particular sound of her laughter, or the exact shape of her worry. That kind of memory, the kind carried directly from person to person through spoken recollection, cannot survive 10,000 years, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But another kind of memory can and did, a memory held not in story but in substance, in bone density and dental wear, in the isotopes locked inside a single tooth, in the genetic material trapped inside a piece of chewed pitch in timber, laid across wet ground and preserved by exactly the conditions that should have destroyed it. This is a strange, comparatively new kind of memory, one earlier generations of historians could never have accessed, made possible only by the patient, painstaking science this story has already described. It cannot tell us what she was like to sit beside on an ordinary evening, but it can tell us with real, growing confidence that she was here, that she was real, that her life followed shapes and rhythms this story has tried honestly to reconstruct. Consider everything this particular life and the countless others like it actually contained. A morning that began, as every morning did, with the quiet automatic work of confirming that everyone under one roof had survived the night. A body carrying real accumulated physical strain, decades of labour written permanently into bone, met without complaint because there was no alternative to meeting it. A pregnancy held alongside genuine unspoken fear, the kind that comes from having witnessed exactly what can go wrong carried forward anyway, because hope in this world, as in ours, rarely waited for certainty before allowing itself to exist. A season of hunger returning every single year, with the same patient, predictable cruelty, met with skill, preparation, and the quiet support of people bound together by more than blood. A world capable of turning suddenly and completely dangerous, not only through the familiar rhythms of season and scarcity, but through forces vast enough to erase an entire coastline in a single afternoon, forces no accumulated wisdom could have fully prepared anyone to face. And running through all of it, underneath the hunger and the danger and the genuine uncertainty of whether any given night would end in waking something else entirely, something this story has tried never to lose sight of, even while describing everything that made this life so difficult. Mastery, tenderness, a shale pendant carved with evident care for reasons its maker never explained. A broken leg tended patiently back to health by people who judged the effort worth making. A story told beside a fire, carrying warning, wrapped inside wonder passed down through more generations than any single memory could hold. This was never simply a life of enduring. It was a life of building, of teaching, of choosing again and again, to invest real effort in things that had no strictly practical justification beyond the simple human fact that they mattered to the people doing them. This is where a story like this one earns whatever weight it carries, not by insisting that this world was simply brutal, though it certainly was that, but by insisting equally and with the same seriousness that it was also full in its own quiet way of exactly the things that make any human life worth living. Skill freely shared rather than hoarded. Grief carried honestly rather than hidden. Joy allowed to exist beside real fear, without either one cancelling the other out. A community that absorbed loss together, rather than leaving any single household to face it alone. These are not modern inventions, however much modern life likes to imagine itself as the origin of genuine human connection and care. They were already here, fully formed 10,000 years ago in a small shelter beside a marsh carried by people whose names we will never know. It is worth pausing on that last thought a little longer, because it carries real weight for how this story ought to be received, rather than simply heard and set aside. Every family this story could have chosen to follow tonight across every landscape this entire era, touched, carried some version of the same combination. This particular family carried real hardship braided together with real tenderness, genuine danger sitting alongside genuine devotion. None of them knew they were being watched across an impossible gulf of time by people who would one day come to know more about the mechanics of their world than they themselves ever could, while still knowing almost nothing about who specifically any of them actually were as individuals. That asymmetry, knowing so much about the shape of a life while knowing so little about the particular person living, it is perhaps the single most honest thing this story can offer. A reminder that history, even at its most carefully researched, remains an act of respectful reconstruction rather than true complete recovery. What this story has tried to do across every part told tonight is hold that honest limitation gently, filling in only what the evidence can actually support and resisting the pull toward inventing false certainty, simply because uncertainty feels less satisfying to sit with. This is perhaps the quiet promise a channel like this one can actually keep night after night, story after story across every era it eventually chooses to visit. Not the promise of a tidy, satisfying resolution to every question a listener might bring to it, since honest history rarely offers that. Not the promise of shielding a listener from the genuine difficulty of what actually happened, since softening the truth would betray the very people this story exists to honor. What remains is something quieter, and in its own way considerably more durable, the promise of real, careful attention given generously to lives that would otherwise remain entirely unexamined, unremembered, folded silently into the enormous, largely unrecorded majority of human experience that history, left to its own usual habits, tends to overlook in favor of thrones and battles and the loud, dramatic turning points that make for easier telling. A single family beside a marsh, 10,000 years gone, deserves exactly the same careful attention this channel gives to empires and massacres, because their lives mattered just as much to the people living them as any king's life ever mattered to him. And it is that piece of pitch, more than anything else this story has offered, that deserves to be the image carried forward from tonight. Somewhere on an unremarkable afternoon 10,000 years ago, a person softened a small piece of birch bark, tar between their teeth, working it carefully, thinking of nothing more than the practical task ahead of them, a tool that needed mending, a day that needed finishing. They set it down, they walked away. They almost certainly never thought of that small discarded object again. And yet it waited patiently in cold, dark mud through every single one of the 10,000 years separating that ordinary afternoon from this one, until a researcher, working with tools and knowledge, that person could never have imagined, lifted it gently from the ground and read directly out of it a fragment of exactly who they had been. Nothing about that moment was meant to last. Almost nothing from a life like theirs was built to last. And yet something did. That is worth sitting with gently as this story begins finally to close. 10,000 years is a very long time, longer than memory, longer than language changes slowly enough to still be recognized. Longer than any single family's history, however, carefully kept can usually reach back and touch with real specificity. And yet a single tooth mark in a piece of ancient tar can still somehow close that distance, if only for a moment. Think of everything that separates you right now from that small marsh fire. Warm walls, a door that locks, food that does not depend on tomorrow's weather, medicine for the fever that would once have simply had to run its course, all of it real, all of it hard-won across generations you will never meet by people whose names have mostly been lost the same way that woman's name has been lost. But some things have not changed at all. The particular comfort of a warm room on a cold night, the quiet relief of checking that the people you love are safe before you finally let yourself rest. The private, complicated mixture of hope and fear that comes with bringing a new life into a world that has never once promised to be gentle. She felt all of that once beside her own small fire, in a shelter built of bent branches and stretched hide at the edge of a marsh that no longer exists. Her daughter grew older that year, or she did not. Her second child was born safely or was not. The story cannot follow her any further than the evidence allows, and the evidence honestly stops here at the edge of this particular winter, in this particular season of hope and worry. That too is worth sitting with gently. Not every story gets a clean ending. Not every life gets remembered by name. Most human beings who have ever lived in every era, in every corner of the world, have vanished from memory almost entirely, leaving behind only the faintest physical trace, if any trace survives at all. And still, somehow none of it was wasted. She could not have known that any part of her would survive. She could not have known that 10,000 years later someone would still be listening. But something did survive. Not her name, not her voice, just the quiet, patient evidence that she was here, that she tried, that she loved the people beside her fire exactly as fiercely as anyone alive tonight loves the people beside their own. Somewhere a fire like hers is burning right now, in a different house, a different century, a different kind of shelter entirely. Someone is checking quietly that the people they love made it safely through the day. The details change, the particular fier underneath it does not. 10,000 years from now, if anyone remains to look, something of this present moment may survive too. Not this exact sentence, not this exact voice, but something, a trace, a fragment. Proof of a kind that someone here cared enough to tend a small fire of their own. That has always been enough, it still is. The mud kept its promise. The fire, wherever it actually burned, has long since gone dark. But somewhere in the quiet space between one breath and the next, it is still in its own way burning.